I dragged my father out of a burning mansion, leaving my own body to be crushed by the collapsing roof. As I lay bleeding in the grass, he looked down at me and called me his crippled son in front of the entire congregation. I swallowed that humiliation in silence until the insurance hearing when his $980,000 claim landed squarely in my name instead. That is when the screaming started. Smoke is a living thing. As a loss assessor, I spent my career walking through the aftermath of disasters, calculating the replacement value of ruined drywall, melted steel, and waterlogged foundations. I knew fire backward and forward from a clinical perspective. I knew how it moved, how it breathed, and how it consumed everything in its path to feed its own hunger. But knowing the mechanics of a fire is entirely different from being trapped inside the belly of one. It was just past midnight when the hardwired smoke alarms at my father's Pennsylvania estate began to shriek. The house was a sprawling century-old colonial, a towering symbol of Richard's status as a respected church elder and a senior country club board member. It was built with heavy oak timbers, imported stone, and expensive mahogany paneling. It was the kind of place designed to make anyone who walked through the front doors feel small and insignificant. Right now, that magnificent house was a massive enclosed furnace. The heat hit me like a physical brick wall the second I kicked open my bedroom door on the second floor. Black, oily smoke was already banking down from the vaulted ceilings, thick, toxic, and suffocating. I dropped to my knees, immediately pressing a damp undershirt to my mouth, and crawled out into the long hallway. The roar of the flames was deafening. It sounded like a freight train was tearing through the formal living room directly below me. I could have gone out the side window of my bedroom. I could have climbed down the decorative ivy trellis and walked away into the cool night air without a single scratch. But my father was still inside. His master suite was at the far end of the hall, directly above the library, where the fire seemed to be originating. I scrambled forward on my hands and knees, my eyes tearing up uncontrollably, my lungs burning with every shallow, desperate breath. The expensive Persian carpet beneath my hands was practically melting, fusing to the skin of my palms. I reached his heavy oak door and shoved it open with my shoulder. Richard was on the floor near the ensuite bathroom, coughing violently, disoriented and blinded by the toxic fumes. He was not clutching a wet towel or a blanket to protect himself. Even in the middle of a blazing inferno, my father prioritized his assets. He was clutching a locked leather briefcase to his chest. I grabbed him by the shoulder, hauling his heavy frame upward. "We have to move right now!" I yelled over the deafening roar of the fire. He stumbled, leaning his dead weight against me. We moved out into the hallway, but the situation had deteriorated in mere seconds. The fire had already breached the main staircase. The massive wooden banister was a terrifying wall of orange and blue fire. The ambient temperature was rising exponentially, blistering the skin on my forearms and the side of my face. We were entirely cut off from the ground floor. The only conceivable way out was the large decorative bay window at the very end of the corridor overlooking the expansive front lawn. We staggered toward it, coughing and choking. Through the thick, swirling smoke and the shattering glass of the downstairs windows, I could see the glow of emergency lights reflecting off the ancient oak trees in the distance. And then I saw him. My younger brother Thomas. He was standing on the pristine front lawn, safely out of reach of the blistering heat. He was wearing his expensive silk pajamas, looking perfectly unbothered and entirely safe. But what made my blood run absolutely cold was his hands. He was not holding a garden hose. He was not running toward the front porch to help us. He was not shouting for us. He was holding up his smartphone. The screen was glowing brightly in the dark, and he was panning the camera, slowly recording the entire mansion as it burned. He was filming our potential death like it was a television show. There was no time to process that sickening betrayal. A deafening structural crack echoed directly above us. The central support beam of the roof, completely compromised by the intense heat rising from the library below, gave way. I looked up and saw a massive flaming section of solid timber falling directly toward my father. I did not think about my own survival. I just reacted on pure instinct. I lunged forward, shoving Richard with all my physical strength toward the bay window. The force of my push sent him crashing through the decorative glass, tumbling out onto the sloped portico roof, just as the flaming beam slammed down onto the floor where he had been standing a split second before. It hit my right shoulder first, shattering my collarbone instantly. The sheer weight of the falling timber drove me straight down into the burning floorboards. The blazing wood pinned my right arm and crushed my right leg against the subflooring. The pain was beyond any human comprehension. It was a white-hot, searing agony that ripped through every nerve ending in my body, overriding my brain entirely. I screamed, but the sound was instantly swallowed by the monstrous roar of the fire. My clothes were singeing. The horrifying smell of my own burning flesh filled my nose, making me gag. I tried wildly to pull my arm free, pulling so hard I felt my own shoulder joint dislocate, but the beam was completely immovable. Through the shattered window frame, I could see my father scrambling off the portico roof, safely dropping down to the soft grass below. He did not look back up at the window. He did not reach a hand out to try and pull me free. He did not scream my name. He just ran across the lawn toward Thomas. The floor beneath me began to buckle and warp. The intense heat was literally boiling the moisture out of my eyes. I realized with absolute terrifying clarity that I was going to die in this hallway, trapped under the burning bones of my father's prized estate. The edges of my vision turned black and fuzzy. The deafening roar of the fire began to fade into a strange, dull hum. I stopped fighting the crushing weight of the beam, let my head fall back against the blistering floor, and let the darkness take me completely. I did not die in that hallway. I woke up to a completely different kind of nightmare. The transition from the blazing corridor to reality was a slow, agonizing crawl through a dense fog of heavy medical narcotics. The very first thing my brain registered was the rhythmic mechanical hissing of a ventilator machine. Then came the smell. It was no longer the acrid, choking stench of wood smoke, but the sterile, sharp, metallic odor of hospital antiseptic. I tried to open my eyes, but my eyelids felt incredibly heavy, swollen shut, and crusted over. I tried to move my hand to touch my face, and that was when the true horror of my reality hit me. It was not the sharp, immediate agony of the falling beam, but a deep, vibrating torment that seemed to radiate outward from my very bone marrow. A low, pathetic groan escaped my throat before I could stop it. Almost immediately, a voice spoke beside my bed. "David, you are awake. Do not try to move your body." I forced my eyes open, blinking against the harsh fluorescent lights of the intensive care unit. As the room slowly came into focus, I saw a doctor standing at the foot of my bed. He had a grim, strictly professional expression, holding a metal clipboard against his chest. I looked down at my own body and felt the breath leave my lungs. My right arm was heavily bandaged in thick white gauze, suspended in the air by a complex system of metal slings and pulleys. More thick bandages wrapped tightly around my torso and covered my entire right leg. Clear plastic tubes and colored wires snaked out from under the thin hospital blankets, connecting my broken body to a bank of digital monitors that beeped relentlessly with every erratic heartbeat. "Water." I croaked, my voice sounding like broken glass grinding together. My throat was incredibly raw from the smoke inhalation and the intubation tube that had apparently just been removed from my airway. A nurse stepped forward quietly, placing a small sponge wet with freezing water to my cracked, blistered lips. I sucked on it greedily, trying to wash away the lingering taste of ash and blood that still clung to the roof of my mouth. "Where is my family?" I asked, my voice barely above a raspy whisper. The doctor looked down at his clipboard, avoiding my eyes for a fraction of a second before answering. "Your father and brother are outside in the waiting room. They have been informed of your condition. But right now, David, we need to talk about your injuries." The solemn tone of his voice made my stomach drop into a bottomless pit. As an insurance loss assessor, I knew exactly how to read bad news. I had delivered bad news 100 times to families standing in the muddy wreckage of their flooded homes or the splintered remains of tornado-ravaged businesses. I knew the careful cadence of professional sympathy. "Tell me," I said, bracing myself against the stiff mattress. The doctor stepped closer to the side of the bed, his expression softening just a fraction. "You were trapped under a burning structural beam for over 12 minutes before the fire department rescue team could extract you from the second floor. You have sustained severe third-degree burns across your right shoulder, your entire right arm, and your right thigh. The necessary skin grafts will require multiple extensive surgeries over the next 6 to 8 months. I stared at the acoustic ceiling tiles, processing the heavy medical words. Third-degree burns. That meant the fire had burned entirely through the epidermis and dermis layers of my skin, destroying the tissue down to the subcutaneous fat and underlying muscle. But there is more. The doctor continued, his voice dropping slightly in volume. The impact of the beam caused massive crush injuries. You have multiple compound fractures in your right arm and your right tibia. The bone broke through the skin in 2 places. The most concerning issue, however, is the permanent nerve damage. I felt a cold, paralyzing chill spread through my chest, cutting straight through the heavy haze of the intravenous pain medication. What do you mean, permanent? The doctor took a slow, heavy breath. The median and ulnar nerves in your right arm were severely crushed by the impact and further damaged by the intense thermal heat. We have done everything surgically possible to repair the neural pathways, but the damage is extensive and irreversible. You are going to lose significant motor function in your right hand and arm. You will likely walk with a permanent limp for the rest of your life. You have a very long, very painful road of physical therapy ahead of you, but you need to understand that your body will never return to the way it was before the fire. The sterile hospital room seemed to shrink violently around me. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor seemed to mock the horrific realization crashing down on my mind. I was 36 years old. My entire livelihood, my entire identity depended on my physical mobility and the dexterity of my hands. As an independent loss assessor, I climbed onto steep, damaged roofs to inspect wind and hail damage. I crawled through dark, flooded dirt crawl spaces to check shifting foundation walls. I drove hundreds of miles a week across the state of Pennsylvania, writing detailed damage reports, analyzing structural integrity, measuring spaces, and documenting physical evidence. My hands were my only tools. My healthy body was my entire career. If I could not climb a ladder safely, if I could not hold a pen steady, or type a comprehensive report with my dominant hand, my career was completely over. I was officially disabled. I lay back against the stiff hospital pillows, staring blankly upward. The water stains on the ceiling tiles blurred as hot tears pooled in the corners of my eyes and tracked down the unburned side of my face. I had sacrificed my physical body, my stable career, and my entire future to push my father out of a burning window to safety. I had saved his life while my brother stood on the pristine lawn filming the disaster for some twisted narcissistic purpose. And now I was broken. I was a piece of damaged property that no insurance policy could ever fully replace or repair. But the physical destruction of my body was only the beginning of my nightmare. I thought the raging fire was the absolute worst thing that could possibly happen to me. I thought the permanent loss of my career would be the lowest point of my entire life. I was completely wrong. The flames had only destroyed my flesh and my bones. What my family was about to do to me out in the waiting room would completely destroy my soul. The doctor squeezed my left uninjured shoulder, offering a few more hollow words of clinical comfort before stepping out of the room to allow my family inside. I took a shallow breath and braced myself. I expected tears. I expected immense gratitude. I expected my father to walk in, take my good hand, and tell me that he loved me, that he was endlessly thankful I had risked my own life to save his. The heavy wooden door of the ICU room swung open. The heavy wooden door of the intensive care unit cracked open just enough for the harsh fluorescent light of the hallway to spill across my bed. I lay entirely paralyzed beneath layers of sterile gauze, my right arm elevated in a complex traction system. The intravenous painkillers did nothing to numb the sharp reality of the voices echoing from the private family waiting area just outside my room. My hearing had become hypersensitive in the wake of the fire. I could hear the distinct sound of leather dress shoes pacing the linoleum floor. I recognized the deep authoritative cadence of my father instantly. Richard was not weeping. He was not shaken by the fact that he had nearly burned to death just hours ago. He was projecting power. He was holding court. Several prominent members of the church council and our lead pastor had rushed to the hospital the moment news of the estate fire broke. They were men who respected my father, men who sat on committees with him and admired his massive wealth. I waited for my father to push past them and rush into my room. I waited for him to fall into the chair beside my bed to grip my uninjured left hand and to thank me for pulling his heavy frame through the shattering glass of the second-floor window. I expected the basic human decency of a father acknowledging the son who had just sacrificed his physical body to save his life. I received absolutely nothing. Instead, I listened as my father commanded the attention of the room. His voice boomed through the narrow gap in my door, rich with practiced theatrical emotion. "The Lord tested our family tonight," Richard announced, his words dripping with false humility. "The flames took the house, but they did not take our spirit. And for that, I have to thank my boy. I have to thank Thomas." My breath caught in my raw, blistered throat. Thomas. My 34-year-old brother who had stood safely on the manicured lawn. The brother who had casually filmed the inferno with his smartphone while my flesh literally melted under a burning structural beam. Thomas acted with the kind of clarity and leadership that makes a father truly proud. Richard continued, his voice echoing loudly enough that every nurse at the station could hear him. He stayed perfectly calm. He took control of the situation. He coordinated with the emergency dispatchers and guided the fire trucks to the correct access points. If Thomas had not been so quick-witted, I do not know if any of us would have survived this terrible tragedy. A chorus of sympathetic murmurs and verbal agreements rippled through the waiting room. The pastor spoke up, his tone thick with admiration. "You raised a fine, strong man, Richard. Thomas is a true blessing to your family in a time of crisis. God was certainly watching over the two of you tonight." I squeezed my eyes shut, fresh tears burning the singed edges of my eyelashes. The sheer audacity of the lie physically sickened me. I had dragged my father through toxic black smoke. I had taken the crushing weight of the collapsing roof to shield him. Thomas had done absolutely nothing but secure his own safety. Yet here was my father publicly transferring my sacrifice onto the golden child. Thomas was the successful high-end real estate broker. Thomas was the handsome, polished son who drove the right cars and attended the right galas. I was just the blue-collar insurance assessor who spent his days crawling through ruined buildings. In my father's eyes, Thomas was the only son worthy of being the hero, but the ultimate betrayal was yet to come. A brief silence fell over the waiting area before one of the older church elders cleared his throat. Richard the elder asked softly, "What about David? We heard he was caught inside the structure. How is he doing?" The pause that followed was the longest, coldest silence of my entire life. I stopped breathing. I waited for my father to finally acknowledge the truth. I waited for him to tell his friends that I was lying in a hospital bed with third-degree burns and crushed bones because I had refused to leave him behind in the flames. When Richard finally spoke, his tone completely shifted. The theatrical warmth vanished, replaced by a cold, dismissive contempt that sliced straight through the morphine in my veins. "David was reckless," my father said flatly. The words hit me harder than the falling beam. He panicked. He rushed in blindly without thinking and ended up getting himself trapped. The firemen had to waste valuable time digging him out of the rubble. It was foolish and completely unnecessary. A collective sigh of pity swept through the men outside. The pastor murmured a soft prayer for my recovery, but my father was not finished. He needed to ensure the narrative was perfectly controlled. He needed to ensure that my broken body would never be seen as a symbol of courage, because that would mean acknowledging that he had needed my help. Richard demanded absolute perfection from his family image, and a permanently injured son was an ugly blemish on his flawless reputation. The doctors just gave me the prognosis. Richard continued, his voice dropping into a harsh, cruel whisper that carried perfectly to my bed. His arm is useless. His leg is ruined. He is never going to work in his field again. Now he is just a crippled son, a massive financial and physical burden to this family. I do not know how we are going to manage the embarrassment of his condition. A crippled son, a burden, an embarrassment. I lay absolutely still in the sterile hospital bed, my heart hammering violently against my bruised ribs. The heart monitor beside me began to beep faster, registering the massive spike in my adrenaline, but I could not move. The physical agony of my burned flesh was suddenly completely overshadowed by a suffocating, crushing wave of mental anguish. He had completely erased me. He had taken my sacrifice, handed the glory to my coward of a brother, and reduced my shattered body to nothing more than a pathetic inconvenience. I was no longer a son. I was a liability. The voices outside gradually faded as the group moved down the hallway toward the cafeteria, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in their wake. I stared blankly at the acoustic tiles on the ceiling, trying to process the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. My own father had discarded me the moment I lost my physical utility, but the cruelty of the night was not over. The heavy wooden door to my room pushed open a few inches wider. I slowly turned my head, fighting the stiffness in my neck. Rebecca stepped into the dimly lit room. My wife of 6 years. She did not rush to my bedside. She did not lean down to kiss my forehead or brush the soot from my hair. She stood near the foot of the bed, perfectly positioned just out of reach, staring at me with an expression of cold, calculated assessment. Rebecca was 34 years old. A woman who had always placed financial security and social comfort above everything else. When we met, she liked my steady income. She liked the respectable, quiet life my career provided. She liked the vacations and the solid retirement plan. Now she looked at the complex traction system holding my ruined right arm. She looked at the thick bandages wrapping my leg. She looked at the digital monitors broadcasting my broken state. I saw her eyes flick toward the clipboard resting at the end of the bed, scanning the medical charts. She was not looking at her husband. She was looking at a catastrophic balance sheet. "Rebecca," I whispered, my voice cracking with desperation. "Please." She slowly crossed her arms over her chest. She wore a tailored beige trench coat entirely out of place in the sterile trauma ward. Her face was set in stone. She did not offer a single word of comfort. Instead, she spoke with a quiet, lethal pragmatism that stripped away the last remaining shreds of my dignity. "I spoke to the surgeon," she said evenly. Her voice lacked any trace of empathy or warmth. "He told me about the nerve damage. He told me you will need multiple skin grafts and extensive reconstructive surgeries over the next year. He told me you are never going to regain full use of that arm." I swallowed hard, fighting the urge to beg for her support. "We can get through this," I rasped. "The insurance will cover the initial surgeries. I can do the physical therapy. I can find desk work. I can pivot." Rebecca let out a short, hollow laugh that sounded more like a scoff. "Pivot," she repeated coldly. "David, you are an independent loss assessor. You climb on roofs. You crawl into foundations. You use your hands. Your entire income depends on your physical capability. You are looking at hundreds of thousands of dollars in out-of-pocket medical expenses. The rehabilitation alone will bankrupt us within months. You are going to be in a wheelchair and then a brace hobbling around the house requiring full-time care." She took a single step closer, her eyes narrowing. "I did not sign up to be a full-time nurse to a disabled man. I did not sign up to drown in medical debt because you decided to play hero for a father who does not even respect you. I heard what Richard said out there in the hallway. He thinks you are a joke. Thomas is going to inherit everything, and you are going to be left with nothing but hospital bills and a useless limb." Her words were precise and deliberate, designed to cut as deeply as possible. The physical pain radiating from my burns was nothing compared to the violent tearing sensation in my chest. The woman I had promised to spend my life with was evaluating my worth based entirely on my earning potential and physical perfection. The moment that potential vanished, so did her loyalty. "I am your husband." I choked out a single tear, spilling over the bridge of my nose and soaking into the white pillowcase. "I nearly died tonight. I need you." Rebecca shook her head slowly, her face entirely devoid of emotion. "You are a liability, David. I have a life to live. I have plans. I cannot let your reckless mistakes drag me down into a life of poverty and pity. I am entirely done." She reached into the pocket of her trench coat and pulled out a folded stack of thick white papers. She stepped forward and dropped them unceremoniously onto the rolling tray table beside my bed. The stark black text at the top of the page was impossible to miss. It was a draft petition for the dissolution of marriage. She had not just made this decision in the heat of the moment. She had clearly been preparing an exit strategy for a while, and my catastrophic injury was simply the perfect catalyst for her departure. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, Rebecca reached for her left hand. She gripped her diamond wedding ring, the ring I had saved for 2 years to purchase, and slid it over her knuckle. The metal made a tiny, sharp clink as she placed it directly on top of the divorce papers. "Do not try to call me," she said, turning her back on me without a single ounce of hesitation. "My lawyer will handle the communications from here on out. Good luck with the surgeries, David." She walked out of the intensive care unit, her heels clicking rhythmically against the linoleum floor, fading away until the only sound left in the room was the mechanical hissing of my ventilator and the rapid, panicked beating of my own heart. I was completely alone. In the span of 6 hours, I had lost my physical health, my career, my father's love, and my marriage. I stared at the wedding ring resting on top of the legal documents, the harsh fluorescent lights reflecting off the diamond. My father had publicly stripped me of my dignity, branding me a crippled burden. My brother had stolen the credit for my sacrifice. My wife had abandoned me to face a mountain of debt and physical agony by myself. They had looked at my broken body and decided collectively that my life was over. The physical trauma of the fire had officially ended, but the mental devastation had just begun dragging me down into a dark, suffocating abyss from which I had no idea how to escape. 6 weeks inside a specialized burn unit permanently alters your perception of reality. Time is no longer measured in days or hours. It is measured entirely in the agonizing increments between pain medication doses and the brutal screaming process of having necrotic skin aggressively scrubbed from your body. When the hospital staff finally placed me in a standard wheelchair to roll me down to the main discharge lobby, I did not feel like a man who had survived a catastrophic house fire. I felt like a hollow shell of a human being. The hospital billing department representative had handed me a thick, heavy manila folder right before the elevator doors opened. As a former commercial insurance loss assessor, I possessed a specialized set of skills. I knew how to read itemized corporate invoices, liability limits, and catastrophic loss charts better than anyone else. I sat in the back of a cheap-smelling taxicab, awkwardly balancing a heavy aluminum crutch against my uninjured knee, and opened the manila folder with my trembling left hand. My right arm, securely suspended in a rigid fiberglass brace, throbbed with a dull, sickening heat with every bump in the road. The final numbers printed at the bottom of the last page literally made my lungs stop functioning. $840,000. My premium tier health insurance had a maximum lifetime payout cap for trauma care that had been completely exhausted exactly 3 weeks ago. The complex synthetic skin grafts, the multiple reconstructive bone surgeries to rebuild my crushed tibia, the endless days racking up charges in the intensive care unit. All of it had spilled over into terrifying astronomical out-of-pocket expenses. According to the final ledger I was currently staring at, over $412,000 in completely uncovered medical debt. I had absolutely no wife left to help me shoulder this crushing financial burden. Rebecca had ensured her aggressive divorce lawyer filed the separation papers before I even woke up from my second major surgery. I had no secure job to return to either. The prestigious insurance firm I contracted for had sent a very polite, legally bulletproof corporate email terminating my active status, explicitly citing my physical inability to perform on-site field inspections. My entire adult life had been meticulously structured, highly organized, and financially secure. Now it was completely and utterly decimated. I just wanted to go home. I rented a modest but incredibly comfortable house in a quiet, affluent Pennsylvania suburb. The property itself was formerly managed by my brother Thomas and his high-end luxury real estate firm. I had never missed a single rent payment in 4 consecutive years. I thought I could at least rest in my own familiar bed, attempt to figure out a desperate payment plan for the hospital billing department, and slowly try to piece together whatever was left of my shattered existence. The yellow taxi pulled up to the pristine curb of my rental house. I fumbled awkwardly with my leather wallet, struggling to pay the impatient driver with my one good hand, and slowly dragged my broken body out of the back seat. Every single step I took with the aluminum crutch sent a violent, agonizing shockwave straight up my shattered leg bones. When I looked up at the familiar front porch of my home, my stomach dropped into a bottomless void. Thomas was standing squarely blocking the front door. He was wearing a custom-tailored navy blue Italian suit, his hair perfectly styled, looking precisely like he had just stepped out of a luxury business magazine. Standing right beside him was his wife, Chloe. She was holding a designer leather handbag that cost more than my monthly salary, wearing oversized sunglasses and casually sipping from a premium iced coffee. They did not look like concerned family members welcoming a severe burn victim back from the edge of death. They looked exactly like ruthless landlords preparing for a pest extermination. "Thomas," I said, my voice incredibly hoarse as I hobbled painfully up the concrete walkway. "What are you doing here at my house?" Chloe lowered her expensive sunglasses, her perfectly made-up eyes scanning my heavily bandaged arm, the thick surgical compression sleeve covering my leg and the angry raised red burn scars creeping up the right side of my neck. Her nose wrinkled in blatant, unapologetic disgust. "Look at you," Chloe said, her voice dripping with absolute elitist contempt. "You look like a walking horror movie, David. You cannot seriously think you are going to live in this community looking like that." I stopped at the bottom of the wooden porch steps, leaning heavily forward on my crutch just to remain upright. "What on earth are you talking about, Chloe? This is my house. I live here." "It is our property, David," she snapped back, immediately taking a step closer to the railing. "This is a premium residential neighborhood. We have young, successful families living here. We have high property values to aggressively maintain. Having a severely disfigured, unemployed, disabled man hobbling around the front yard brings down the entire aesthetic of the street. It is depressing to look at, and frankly, it is terrible for our real estate business." I stared at her, genuinely unable to comprehend the sheer lack of basic human empathy standing in front of me. I dragged my father out of a burning building. I said, my voice shaking with a suddenly rising hot anger. "I sacrificed my own physical body so your father-in-law could live to see another day." Thomas stepped forward, holding up a manicured, perfectly clean hand to stop me from speaking. "Do not dare pull that pathetic victim card with us, David. We all know you simply panicked during the fire. Dad told everyone at the church exactly what really happened that night. You were reckless. You stupidly got yourself trapped under a beam, and now you want everyone in town to feel sorry for you. I am absolutely not going to let your poor life choices drag down my corporate real estate portfolio." Thomas reached into the inside silk pocket of his expensive suit jacket and pulled out a crisp, cleanly folded legal document. He did not extend his hand to give it to me directly. He tossed it casually through the air, letting the paper flutter down onto the porch steps to land right by my good foot. "What is that?" I asked. though my chest was already tightening with a familiar suffocating dread. "That is a formal, legally binding notice of eviction," Thomas said, checking his heavy gold wristwatch as if I were wasting his valuable time. "You are officially 30 days late on your rent. Since you were busy lying uselessly in a hospital bed, and since Rebecca formally vacated the premises last week and legally removed her name from the master lease, you are in total breach of contract. Furthermore, I know for a fact your insurance firm dropped you. You have zero verifiable income. You are an immense financial liability, and my company does not rent properties to liabilities." "You are my own brother," I said, staring blankly at the perfectly polished tips of his expensive leather shoes. "I have paid your firm on time every single month for 4 straight years. I just got out of the intensive care unit less than an hour ago. You cannot legally or morally do this to me. This is strict business," David Thomas replied with a cold, terrifying corporate smile. "You of all people should understand exactly how strict contracts work. You calculate structural and financial risk for a living, or at least you used to when you were whole. You are a massive walking risk right now. I have already signed a highly qualified new tenant who moves into this house on Monday morning. The new tenant makes 6 figures a year and does not come with a mountain of unpayable medical debt." I stood there in the bright afternoon sun, the immense physical pain radiating deep in my bones, completely eclipsed by the profound, shocking cruelty of my own flesh and blood. Thomas had stood safely on the pristine lawn, recording the devastating fire while I literally burned alive. Now he was mercilessly throwing me out onto the street the very moment I became financially useless to his perfect, curated image. "My things are still inside," I said, my voice dropping to a low, entirely defeated whisper. "We know," Chloe chimed in again, sounding entirely bored by my suffering. "We had a professional moving crew come by yesterday afternoon. They packed up all of Rebecca's beautiful things and shipped them directly to her new luxury apartment downtown. Since you actively failed to pay your rent, your larger furniture has been officially seized by our company to cover the outstanding balance and the deep cleaning fees. We boxed up your cheap clothes and personal bathroom items." Thomas pointed vaguely to the dark side of the porch. 2 large, battered plastic suitcases sat silently in the shadows. That was absolutely it. My entire adult life, my respected career, my comfortable home. Everything I had meticulously built was reduced to 2 cheap suitcases sitting on a cold concrete slab. "You have exactly 10 minutes to get yourself off my property," Thomas said, turning his back on me and confidently unlocking the front door. "If you are still lingering on the public sidewalk, making a pathetic scene when I look out the window, I will immediately call the police and have you physically removed and arrested for trespassing." Thomas and Chloe walked gracefully inside the house, shutting the heavy wooden door firmly behind them. The deadbolt lock clicked loudly, a sharp, final metallic sound that echoed brutally in the quiet suburban air. I did not scream in anger. I did not bang my fists on the door or beg them for mercy. I had learned very quickly in the trauma ward that begging only drains the vital energy you need to physically survive another day. I slowly dragged my broken body over to the 2 suitcases. I could not possibly carry them both simultaneously while relying on a crutch to walk. I had to awkwardly loop the handle of one suitcase over my good left shoulder and drag the other one loudly and clumsily across the rough pavement. Every single step I took was pure agonizing torture. My burned, tight skin stretched and pulled painfully against the sterile bandages. My broken leg screamed in violent protest with every shifting movement, but I forced myself to keep walking. I walked slowly down the street, away from the pristine green lawns and the expensive imported cars, carrying the absolute heavy realization that I was entirely fundamentally alone in the world. By late nightfall, I had finally found the only place in the entire city that would willingly take a man with no job, no credit score, and a physical body completely broken by fire. It was a rotting, structurally compromised, dilapidated boarding house located on the extreme edge of the dangerous industrial district, miles away from the wealth, safety, and immense privilege of my father's world. The tiny room I rented with my last remaining cash was no larger than a standard walk-in closet. The faded floral wallpaper was actively peeling in long yellowed strips from the damp walls, and the single cracked window looked directly out over a rusted chain-link fence and an endless row of abandoned graffiti-covered warehouses. The mattress was incredibly thin, sagging deeply in the middle, and smelled strongly of stale mildew and cheap chemical bleach. There was a constant unsettling scratching sound coming from the rats moving inside the hollow walls. I sat heavily on the edge of the sagging bed, my aluminum crutch resting against a remarkably dirty wooden nightstand. I looked at the 2 plastic suitcases sitting on the scuffed, sticky linoleum floor. I had exactly $45 left in my entire wallet. My savings accounts had been utterly decimated by the initial emergency room co-pays and the exorbitant legal retainers my lawyer had aggressively demanded before ultimately dropping my divorce defense case against Rebecca. The tiny room was freezing cold. The ancient iron radiator hissed weakly in the corner, but produced absolutely no tangible heat. I pulled my good arm tightly around my chest, shivering uncontrollably, feeling the deep throbbing ache settle permanently into my shattered leg bones. Then my cell phone began to vibrate violently on the dirty nightstand. The cracked screen lit up the dark room, displaying an unknown, out-of-state area code. I knew exactly who it was. The relentless calls had started 2 full days before I even left the safety of the hospital ward. I reached out with my trembling left hand and swiped the screen to answer. David, a sharp, highly aggressive corporate voice barked through the tiny speaker. "This is a senior representative calling from Apex Medical Recovery Services. We are contacting you regarding an outstanding critical balance of $412,000 formally assigned to your account. We need to establish a strict payment schedule immediately, or we will instantly begin the legal process of aggressive wage garnishment and total asset seizure." "I have no wages to garnish," I said quietly into the freezing dark room. "I have no assets left to seize. I have absolutely nothing left to my name." The debt collector did not care about my reality. The collections process is entirely blind to personal circumstance, the voice warned mechanically, devoid of any humanity. "If you do not provide a valid bank routing number by the end of this business day, we will escalate this file to a total legal judgment. You will never be able to secure stable housing, financial credit, or legal employment ever again. We will pursue you indefinitely until this debt is satisfied." I hung up the phone and dropped it onto the thin blanket. It immediately started vibrating again. Another unknown number. Another aggressive collection agency ready to pick the remaining meat off my broken bones. I was completely trapped. I was a wounded, bleeding animal backed into a dark, suffocating corner. My powerful father had stolen my dignity and publicly branded me a useless cripple. My golden brother had legally stolen my home and tossed me like garbage into the slums. My beautiful wife had walked away without looking back the exact second my bank account stopped growing. I had absolutely no physical strength left to fight back. I could not outrun the massive medical debt. I could not outrun the crushing public humiliation. I lay back on the terrible-smelling mattress, staring blankly up at the spreading water stains on the ceiling. The dark shadows in the tiny room seemed to press down heavily on my chest, absolute and suffocating. I had played completely by the rules my entire life. I had worked incredibly hard, built a steady, respectable career from nothing, and ultimately sacrificed my own physical body to save the man who gave me life. And my final reward for all of that loyalty was total, unmitigated destruction. The phone kept vibrating, buzzing relentlessly against the cheap bedding like an angry insect. The walls kept scratching with unseen vermin. The freezing air seeped deep into my burn scars, causing my muscles to spasm. This was the absolute lowest point of human existence. I was rapidly drowning in an endless ocean of debt and betrayal, and every single possible escape route was permanently blocked. The freezing dampness of the slum boarding house was actively attacking my ruined body. I lay flat on the sagging mattress, staring at the peeling floral wallpaper, while a relentless stabbing pain radiated from my crushed right tibia. The cheap, over-the-counter ibuprofen I had bought at a corner pharmacy 2 days ago was completely gone. The empty plastic bottle sat on the sticky linoleum floor, mocking my absolute desperation. Without the prescription-grade painkillers the hospital had initially given me, the grafted skin across my right shoulder and arm felt like it was actively being held to an open flame. Every breath I took was a jagged, exhausting effort. I checked my bank account balance on my cracked phone screen. $8.42. That was the sum total of my entire existence. I could not afford a single hot meal, let alone the specialized nerve medication my body was violently demanding. My tiny room was littered with unopened letters from aggressive medical debt collectors. The final hospital bill was over $400,000, and I was completely drowning in the aggressive threats of wage garnishment and asset seizure. I was backed into a corner of pure physical and financial agony. I had to swallow the last remaining shred of my pride. I had to go to my father. Richard had not missed a single beat after the fire destroyed our family estate. While I was fighting for my life on a hospital ventilator, his expensive insurance brokers had rapidly secured him a temporary luxury residence in an exclusive gated community on the north side of the city. I spent 4 of my last $8 on a municipal bus pass to get there. The sky opened up into a freezing, torrential downpour the exact moment I stepped off the public bus. I dragged my heavy aluminum crutch through the slick, freezing puddles, and my cheap clothes instantly soaked completely through to my sensitive skin. The cold rain lashed aggressively against my raw burn scars, sending violent muscle spasms straight up my neck. By the time I reached the massive iron gates of his temporary neighborhood, I was shaking so uncontrollably I could barely stand upright. The private security guard at the gatehouse looked at me like I was a diseased stray animal, but after making a highly reluctant phone call, the heavy iron gates slowly swung open. I hobbled up the long, perfectly manicured driveway toward a sprawling, modern stone townhouse that looked like a fortress of immense wealth. Bright, warm light spilled from the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, cutting directly through the dark, freezing rain. I reached the covered front portico and leaned heavily against the polished oak door, gasping for air. Before I could even knock, the door was pulled open by a private caterer carrying a silver tray of empty champagne flutes. The blast of warm, climate-controlled air from the grand foyer hit my freezing, soaked body like a physical blow. I stepped inside the entryway, dripping dirty rainwater all over the expensive imported marble tiles. The sounds of loud, jovial laughter echoed from the formal dining room down the hall. I dragged my crutch across the marble, following the noise of celebration. When I reached the arched doorway of the dining room, the scene unfolding in front of me made my empty stomach violently churn. Richard and Thomas were standing by a massive marble fireplace, holding crystal glasses of expensive amber scotch. They were not mourning the loss of our historic family home. They were absolutely glowing with triumphant greed. Thomas was holding up a printed financial spreadsheet, tracing a line down the paper with his perfectly manicured finger, while he laughed loudly. $980,000 in pure liquid cash, Thomas said loudly, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. The insurance adjuster signed off on the total loss evaluation this very morning. The wire transfer hits the family trust account by next Friday. We are completely clear, Dad. The real estate debts are officially wiped out, and we have nearly $1 million in surplus capital to start the new commercial development project. Richard took a long, satisfied sip of his scotch, his chest swelling with arrogant pride. I told you to trust the process, Thomas. The fire was a tragedy, yes, but a tragedy is just an unexpected financial opportunity if you know exactly how to leverage the proper paperwork. We are walking away from those ashes stronger and richer than we have ever been in our entire lives. They raised their crystal glasses for a celebratory toast. That was when Richard finally noticed me standing silently in the doorway. His triumphant smile instantly vanished and was quickly replaced by a deep, terrifying scowl of pure, unadulterated disgust. I was completely soaked, shivering violently and leaning my broken body against the doorframe just to remain upright. The dirty rainwater was actively pooling around my single good shoe, staining his pristine white marble floor. "What in the name of God are you doing inside my house?" Richard barked, slamming his crystal glass down onto the heavy mahogany dining table. I specifically told the security gate not to let solicitors or vagrants onto this private property. I took a slow, agonizing step forward into the dining room. My voice was a weak, pathetic rasp compared to his booming authority. "I need your help," I whispered, staring directly into the cold, unforgiving eyes of the man I had pulled from a burning hallway just 6 weeks ago. "I am completely out of money. I have absolutely no painkillers left for my burns. My crushed leg is badly infected and I cannot even afford the pharmacy copay for the basic antibiotics. I just need $200, Dad. Just enough to get my critical prescriptions filled so I can physically survive the end of the week. I swear I will pay you back the exact second I can find some kind of desk work." Thomas let out a sharp, highly exaggerated bark of cruel laughter. "Did you hear that, Dad? The brilliant independent insurance assessor is begging for loose change like a common street addict." Thomas walked slowly toward me, looking me up and down as if I were a piece of rotting garbage that had washed up on the shore. "Look at yourself, David." Thomas sneered, his face twisting with mockery. "You are a complete disaster. You lost your high-paying job, your beautiful wife walked out on you the second you got hurt, and now you are crashing our private celebration to beg for drug money. You are truly pathetic. You honestly bring down the value of this entire room just by standing in it." Richard did not even bother to look at my face. He turned his back to me, staring deeply into the roaring gas fireplace. "I do not owe you a single dime, David. You made your own reckless choices the night of the estate fire, and now you are facing the brutal financial consequences. I will not enable your weakness. I will not let you siphon hard-earned money from the massive settlement Thomas and I worked so incredibly hard to strictly secure today. $200 is absolutely nothing to you," I pleaded, the sheer desperation entirely stripping away whatever pride I had left. "You are literally standing here celebrating a $980,000 fire insurance payout. I dragged you out of that inferno. I took the collapsing roof across my own back. I saved your life. If I had not pushed you out that window, you would not be standing here drinking expensive scotch. You would be dead in the ashes." Richard spun around so fast the remaining scotch sloshed wildly out of his glass and onto the rug. "Do not ever speak to me with that disrespectful tone," he roared, his face flushing dark red with pure sudden rage. "You did not save anything at all. You foolishly panicked in the smoke and got yourself trapped under a falling beam like an amateur. Thomas is the one who calmly managed the crisis from the lawn. Thomas is the one aggressively securing our financial future with the insurance claim. You are absolutely nothing to this family anymore. You are a walking, breathing liability dragging us down." He snapped his fingers sharply toward a private servant standing quietly in the corner of the dining room. "Bring me the garbage we dug out of the library ruins yesterday," Richard ordered coldly, never taking his furious eyes off my broken frame. The servant nodded nervously, scurrying out of the room and returning a brief moment later holding a heavy, severely charred tin box. It was completely covered in thick black soot and heavy orange rust, the metal warped and blistered by extreme heat. The servant hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the hostile situation, before awkwardly shoving the dirty box into my uninjured left hand. The heavy rusted tin was freezing cold to the touch. I stared down at the blackened metal box, utterly confused by the gesture. My fingers smeared the thick, greasy soot across the rusted lid, exposing a faint engraving of our family crest. "What is this?" I asked, my voice completely hollow and shaking. "That is the only piece of the past I am allowing you to walk away with," Richard said, stepping forward until he was mere inches from my face, his breath smelling strongly of alcohol. "Your grandfather always liked to hoard useless rubbish. He kept that stupid tin box locked away in the estate library for decades, like it actually meant something valuable. But it is just trash. And you are rubbish too, David." Richard pointed a stiff finger directly at my chest. "You are a broken, useless cripple who brings absolutely no value to the table. I want you to take your pathetic little inheritance and get out of my sight immediately. Never let me see your crippled state disgrace this family ever again. If you ever show your face at my door after tonight, I will not hesitate to have the local police arrest you for trespassing and harassment." Thomas stood grinning widely in the background, entirely amused by my total and complete humiliation. He raised his glass to me in a mocking, silent toast to celebrate my final exile. I stood completely frozen in the grand, opulent dining room, the heavy, charred tin box weighing down my left arm. The deep, throbbing pain in my crushed leg flared up violently, a harsh, brutal reminder of the physical price I had paid for my blind loyalty to this terrible man. They were actively laughing at me. They were standing in a warm, luxurious mansion celebrating a massive cash fortune born from a fire that had systematically destroyed my entire physical life, and they were handing me a box of burned garbage as my final permanent dismissal. I did not say another single word. I did not waste my failing breath defending my honor or begging for the medical money I so desperately needed to survive the week. The finality of the moment crushed the last remaining shred of hope out of my chest. I gripped the cold, rusted metal of the box tightly against my soaked shirt. I turned around awkwardly on my single aluminum crutch and dragged my broken body back out through the grand marble foyer, leaving a trail of dirty water in my wake. I pushed the heavy oak front door open and stepped back out into the freezing, violent storm. The heavy torrential rain instantly soaked through my thin clothes again, washing the dark black soot from the tin box down onto my trembling fingers. The cold wind howled around me as I hobbled slowly down the long manicured driveway, completely and permanently exiled from my own bloodline. I did not look back at the warm, glowing windows of the townhouse. I just kept my head down, clutching the ruined, worthless box against the pouring rain, marching straight back into the dark, unforgiving night. The violent storm outside showed no signs of stopping by the time I finally dragged my broken body back into the freezing boarding house. My cheap clothes were completely saturated with freezing rain, and the heavy soot from the tin box had smeared completely across my shirt. Every single step up the rotting wooden staircase to my tiny room sent a blinding shockwave of agony straight up my crushed right tibia. I had absolutely no prescription painkillers left to dull the sensation. My burned skin felt like it was actively being ripped open with every shallow breath I took. I pushed my flimsy door open and collapsed heavily onto the sagging mattress. I let my aluminum crutch fall loudly to the sticky linoleum floor. I sat there in the dark room for a very long time, listening to the relentless scratching of the rats inside the damp walls. I stared down at the heavily charred box resting on my lap. Richard had literally thrown this blackened metal at my face. He called it garbage. He called me garbage. He told me that my grandfather liked to hoard rubbish, and that I was nothing more than a pathetic, worthless cripple who was no longer recognized by my own bloodline. The sheer cruelty of his words echoed over and over in the silence of my freezing room. But as I stared closely at the deep layer of orange rust and the melted black soot covering the heavy metal, a strange realization began to push through the heavy fog of my physical exhaustion. My grandfather was an incredibly meticulous man. He built his massive wealth from nothing, and he never wasted a single square inch of space on frivolous sentimentality. He did not keep garbage. He did not hoard useless rubbish. If he had intentionally secured a heavy reinforced metal box inside the foundational structure of the Grand Library, it was not because he wanted to preserve trash. I shifted my body weight awkwardly on the terrible mattress, trying to relieve the throbbing pressure on my casted leg. I reached out with my left hand and ran my fingers over the rusted padlock securing the front latch. It was thick and heavy, completely fused together by decades of moisture and the intense thermal heat of the recent house fire. Opening it was going to require tools I simply did not possess and physical strength I no longer had. But the burning desperation in my chest was far stronger than the physical agony in my broken bones. I had absolutely nothing else to lose. I needed to know what my grandfather had hidden. I forced myself to stand back up. I remembered seeing a rusted, discarded toolbox sitting under the leaking sink in the communal bathroom down the hall. I dragged my heavy leg down the dark corridor and found it. Inside was a dull hacksaw blade, a small bottle of industrial chemical solvent, and a heavy flathead screwdriver. I brought them back to my freezing room and locked the flimsy door behind me. The physical process of breaking into that charred box was pure unfiltered torture. I did not have the use of my right hand to hold the heavy metal steady. I had to sit on the floor and awkwardly wedge the burning cold tin box between my uninjured left knee and my thick plaster leg cast. I poured the harsh chemical solvent directly over the fused padlock. The pungent, toxic smell of the chemicals instantly filled the tiny room, burning my eyes and making my raw throat close up. I waited for the solvent to eat away at the thick layers of rust and melted soot. Then I picked up the dull hacksaw blade with my left hand. I sawed at the thick metal shackle for what felt like endless agonizing hours. Because I was right-handed, using my left arm felt incredibly clumsy and weak. The jagged metal teeth of the saw kept slipping off the rusted lock and slicing directly into the knuckles of my left hand. Bright red blood mixed with the black soot and the orange rust dripping steadily onto the scuffed linoleum floor. My right shoulder throbbed with a sickening burning heat, sending waves of nausea crashing through my empty stomach. The cheap aluminum crutch had left deep bruises under my arm, but I refused to stop. I gritted my teeth against the blinding pain, channeling every single ounce of betrayal, every single insult, and every single moment of public humiliation into the repetitive mechanical motion of the metal saw. Richard called me a crippled burden. Thomas laughed at my destroyed body. Chloe told me I devalued their pristine neighborhood. Rebecca walked away because I was no longer a profitable investment. They had all looked at my absolute worst moment and decided I was completely worthless. I pressed the saw blade down harder, letting the physical pain anchor my mind. It was nearly 4 o'clock in the morning when the thick metal shackle finally let out a loud, sharp crack. The rusted lock snapped completely in half, falling heavily onto the floorboard. I dropped the bloody hacksaw blade and took a long, shuddering breath, wiping the sweat and dirt from my forehead with the back of my trembling wrist. I placed my left hand on the heavy lid of the charred box and slowly pulled it open. The rusted hinges screamed loudly in the quiet room. I leaned forward, expecting to see exactly what Richard had promised. I expected to find old, faded photographs, useless family trinkets, or worthless sentimental garbage. Instead, I found 3 thick, heavy rectangular pouches perfectly stacked inside the metal interior. They were completely untouched by the fire or the water. I recognized the distinct olive green material immediately. They were specialized military-grade fireproof and waterproof document storage bags. The kind of specialized security pouches designed to survive catastrophic structural collapses and extreme thermal events. My grandfather had not hidden random memories in the library. He had hidden something incredibly highly classified. I carefully pulled the first heavy pouch out of the box and untied the thick protective cord. I reached inside and pulled out a massive stack of incredibly dense formal legal documents. The paper was slightly yellowed at the extreme edges from decades of age, but the heavy black ink was perfectly legible. At that exact moment, a profound fundamental shift occurred inside my brain. I was no longer the broken, discarded son crying in a freezing slum. The intense pain radiating from my burned flesh faded into the distant background. My mind immediately switched back into the sharp, analytical mode of a senior commercial insurance loss assessor. I spent my entire career reading complex liability contracts, impenetrable corporate legalese, and massive property deeds. I knew how to completely decode financial language better than any high-priced attorney in the city. I spread the thick stack of yellowed documents out across the sagging bed mattress, using the weak ambient light from the street lamp outside my window to read the dense text. The very first document I analyzed was the original master property deed for the sprawling luxury estate that had just burned to the ground. My eyes scanned the legal transfer clauses and my heart completely stopped in my chest. The first shocking truth hit me like a physical earthquake. The massive multi-million-dollar estate did not belong to my father. Richard had paraded around the country club for decades, acting like the absolute king of a self-made empire. He had lorded his massive property over everyone, demanding total respect and complete obedience, because he supposedly owned the very ground we all walked on. But the legal documents completely destroyed his entire manufactured reality. The estate was never legally transferred into Richard's name. My grandfather had placed the entire physical property, the land, the main house, and every single structural asset into an ironclad, irrevocable trust fund over 30 years ago. Richard was legally listed as nothing more than a lifetime custodial tenant. He had absolute zero actual ownership equity in the land. His entire grand identity, his entire source of immense public pride was built on a massive, carefully constructed legal illusion. He was essentially just a glorified renter living inside a house that my grandfather completely controlled from beyond the grave. I sat perfectly still, listening to the loud pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears. I reached for the second military pouch and pulled out the primary insurance policy documents. This was my professional domain. I knew exactly where to look for the hidden clauses, the specific riders, and the payout structures. The policy covering the grand estate was a comprehensive catastrophic loss agreement. It stated clearly that in the event of a total structural destruction by fire, the insurance firm was legally obligated to pay out exactly $980,000 in pure liquid cash. Richard and Thomas were actively celebrating this exact number right now in their warm luxury townhouse, believing the money was going to land directly into their personal bank accounts by next Friday. But they had never read the original foundation documents of the irrevocable trust. As a professional assessor, I immediately located the primary beneficiary clause. An insurance payout on a property held strictly in a trust does not go to the lifetime custodial tenant. The check is not legally permitted to be cut in the name of the resident. The payout must go directly to the sole named beneficiary of the trust itself. I aggressively flipped through the dense stack of papers, searching for the specific trust designation addendum. I found a thick document sealed with a heavy red wax stamp. I broke the wax with my thumb and opened the heavy parchment paper. It was a formal legal declaration signed directly by my grandfather just months before he passed away. I read the opening paragraph and the air completely left my lungs. The document clearly stated that my grandfather firmly believed his son Richard lacked the basic moral integrity required to manage the family legacy. The legal text outlined that Richard was driven entirely by a dangerous narcissistic greed and a profound obsession with superficial appearances. My grandfather specifically noted that Richard would eagerly sacrifice his own family members to protect his public wealth, and that Thomas possessed the exact same reckless, cowardly nature. Because of this absolute certainty, my grandfather had constructed a brilliant legal trap. The trust was designed to completely bypass Richard and Thomas in the event of a total liquidation or a catastrophic loss of the main property. I moved my eyes down to the final legally binding sentence on the page. The text was incredibly clear, leaving absolutely no room for legal misinterpretation or corporate arbitration. It read that the sole legal beneficiary of the irrevocable trust and the single authorized recipient of any and all subsequent insurance payouts resulting from the total loss of the property was his grandson David. My grandfather had secretly designated me as the sole beneficiary of the entire estate value. He knew I was the only person in the family who valued hard work over unearned luxury. He knew I possessed the internal strength to actually rebuild rather than blindly consume. He saw the pure darkness hiding inside my father decades before my father ever left me to die in a burning hallway. I sat on the cold linoleum floor of the dilapidated slum housing, surrounded by the dense legal documents, and slowly lowered my head into my trembling left hand. Richard had tried to completely destroy my life today. He had thrown this rusted box at my face and called me a worthless, crippled burden. He had proudly bragged about using the $980,000 insurance payout to wipe out his massive debts and start a brand new corporate venture with the brother who had gleefully filmed my physical destruction. They thought they had completely won. They thought they had successfully discarded the dead weight and secured a massive fortune from the ashes of the fire. But they were entirely wrong. The very box Richard had arrogantly thrown at me to complete my humiliation contained the exact legal mechanism to absolutely destroy him. He did not own the property. He did not own the insurance claim. He did not own the future. The $980,000 did not legally belong to my father. It belonged entirely and exclusively to me. A slow, cold sense of absolute clarity washed over my exhausted, broken body. The intense physical pain in my arm and my leg did not magically disappear, but it was suddenly entirely manageable. I was no longer a victim waiting to be crushed by a mountain of medical debt. I was the sole legal heir to a massive financial settlement that was currently sitting in the processing department of a major insurance firm. My father had intentionally left me in that burning hallway to die so he could secure his precious briefcase and his perfect image. He had stolen my health, my career, and my dignity without a single ounce of human remorse. He thought I was just a broken man with absolutely no power to fight back. I carefully gathered the yellowed legal documents and placed them safely back inside the olive-green military fireproof pouches. I wiped the dried blood from my left hand onto my ruined pants. I looked at the cracked window, watching the freezing rain continue to fall aggressively on the dark, empty city streets outside. I had exactly 1 week before the insurance company was scheduled to host the final settlement hearing and officially cut the massive check. 1 week to prepare the absolute destruction of my father's entire universe. I smiled in the cold, dark room for the very first time since the fire. The rusted tin box sat empty on the stained floorboards of my slum apartment, but the documents scattered around me held a weight heavier than anything I had ever carried. I sat there in the dim light of a flickering bulb, while my crushed leg throbbed with a dull and relentless pain. My right arm was wrapped in cheap bandages, but I ignored the agony. My eyes were fixed on the yellowed pages of old financial ledgers tucked securely beneath the trust documents. These ledgers were the final piece of a puzzle my grandfather had left behind. I carefully turned the fragile pages using my one good hand. The ink was faded, but the numbers were exact. My grandfather had meticulously recorded every asset and every hidden reserve. He built a financial fortress designed specifically to keep my father Richard away from the core wealth. But as I read deeper into the ledgers, I realized this was not just about protecting money. It was about anticipating a disaster. My mind shifted from the documents to the night of the inferno. As a former insurance adjuster, I had spent my entire career analyzing disasters. I knew how fires behaved. I knew how they breathed and how they moved and how they consumed everything in their path. Fires are not random. They tell a story. They leave a signature on the very ashes they create. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. The screen was cracked, but it still worked. Before I was fired and blacklisted, I had managed to pull the preliminary fire scene photos from the central insurance database. I opened the file and began to scroll through the high-resolution images of the ruined estate. I zoomed in on the structural remains of the East Wing. I studied the charring on the support beams and the ash patterns on the concrete foundation. In my profession, we look for something called the V pattern. It is the distinct shape flames make as they rise from their point of origin. I swiped to the next photo and then the next. My eyes scanned the blackened skeleton of the home I once lived in. The destruction was massive, but the V patterns all pointed downward. They all converged toward a single location in the basement. My breath caught in my throat. I zoomed in closer on the basement floor plan. The origin point was not the kitchen. It was not the faulty wiring in the living room ceiling. The core of the inferno had erupted from the solvent storage cellar. The storage cellar was a reinforced concrete room built beneath the main floor. My grandfather used it to store industrial solvents and heavy cleaning chemicals from his old manufacturing days. The room had thick stone walls and a heavy steel door designed to keep hazardous materials safely contained. There was absolutely no reason for a spark to ignite inside that room. It was cool and damp and sealed off from the rest of the house. I stared at the photograph of the cellar door. The steel was warped outward from an immense internal explosion. An explosion of that magnitude meant someone had deliberately gathered accelerants and ignited them inside that highly combustible space. But there was one detail that made my blood run cold. The steel door to the solvent cellar had a specialized vintage lock. My grandfather had custom built it, and there was only one key in existence. When he died, he handed that key directly to Richard. My father wore it on his keychain like a badge of authority. He never let anyone else near that room. He always said it was too dangerous for anyone but him to access. If the fire started inside that locked cellar, it meant only one person could have opened the door to plant the accelerants. My father. I dropped the phone onto the floor. My hands began to shake uncontrollably. Richard set the fire. My own father had deliberately burned the multi-million-dollar estate to the ground. But why would he destroy his own home? I looked back down at the ledgers and the trust documents. The pieces of the sinister plot began to snap together with horrifying clarity. I remembered the smug look on Thomas's face when he threw me out onto the street. I remembered Chloe and her expensive designer clothes. For years, Thomas had been playing the role of a successful real estate investor. He drove luxury cars and took lavish vacations and threw parties that cost more than my annual salary. But the truth was, Thomas had nothing. The ledgers I found contained a separate folder of private investigations my grandfather had commissioned before he died. He knew Thomas was a fraud. Thomas had leveraged everything he owned on dangerous margin loans to sustain his illusory lifestyle with Chloe. When the market dipped, those margin calls came due. Thomas was drowning in millions of dollars of debt, and the banks were preparing to seize everything he had. Richard knew his favorite son was facing total financial ruin and public humiliation. Richard could not stand the thought of his golden boy going to prison or losing his status. But Richard did not have the liquid cash to save Thomas. The estate was tied up in the trust, and my grandfather had made sure Richard could not simply sell the land. Richard needed cash quickly. He needed the fire insurance payout. The policy was worth exactly $980,000 in immediate cash relief. It was the perfect amount to pay off the aggressive margin loans and keep Thomas out of prison. Richard plotted the arson to trigger the payout. He went down into the solvent cellar and opened the door with his exclusive key. He poured the chemicals and rigged the ignition. He decided that sacrificing the house was a fair price to pay to save his precious younger son. But as I sat there in the cold and empty room, a darker and far more terrifying realization crept into my mind. The insurance payout was supposed to go to the legal beneficiary of the estate. Richard thought he was the beneficiary. He thought the money would flow directly into his hands once the ashes cooled. But my grandfather had secretly designated me as the sole legal beneficiary of the trust and all its attached insurance claims. Did Richard know about the beneficiary clause? I frantically flipped through the documents again. I found a copy of a legal notice my grandfather's attorney had sent to Richard 1 month before the fire. The notice explicitly informed Richard that the estate was locked in the trust, and that David was the sole heir to all insurance proceeds in the event of a total loss. Richard knew. He knew the money would not go to him. He knew the $980,000 would go directly to me. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped animal. The night of the fire played back in my memory, but this time the lens was wiped clean of all deception. I remembered waking up to the smell of smoke. I remembered running down the hallway to find my father. I found him near the staircase. I thought he was trapped. I leaped across the collapsing floorboards to push him to safety. I took the falling beam to my own body. I sacrificed my arm and my leg to save him. But Richard was not trapped. He was waiting. He knew I would come for him. He knew I was the kind of son who would risk everything to save his family. He staged his own peril near the most structurally compromised part of the house. He set the fire to get the money, but he could only claim that money if the sole beneficiary was dead. Richard did not just want to commit insurance fraud, he wanted to commit murder. He locked the cellar door and let the inferno rage upward directly beneath my bedroom. He intended for me to burn alive in my sleep. When I woke up and found him, he used the chaos to ensure I was crushed by the falling debris. He watched the burning beam shatter my bones, and he did not reach out to help me. He let me fall. He walked out of the burning house and hugged Thomas on the lawn while I bled out in the flames. The physical pain in my crippled body suddenly felt entirely insignificant compared to the crushing agony of this betrayal. My father had orchestrated my death to steal my inheritance and fund my brother's pathetic vanity. He looked at me in the hospital with disgust, not because I was disabled, but because I had survived. My survival ruined his perfect plan. I was the crippled son who refused to die, and my existence blocked him from claiming the blood money he needed. I gathered the documents and placed them carefully back into the charred tin box. The box my father had thrown at my face like a piece of garbage. He thought he was mocking me. He thought he was giving me worthless ashes. He was so blinded by his own arrogance that he never bothered to pry open the box and see what my grandfather had hidden inside. His greed had made him sloppy. His hatred for me had made him blind. I stood up slowly and leaned heavily on my wooden crutch. The slum apartment felt different now. It was no longer a cage of despair. It was a war room. I looked at the blackened box on the table. It held the evidence of arson and the proof of massive financial fraud and the motive for attempted murder. My father and my brother thought they had stripped me of my dignity and my future. They thought I was a broken and useless cripple who would quietly rot away in the slums. They were preparing to fly to Hawaii and celebrate their new fortune built on my crushed bones. They had no idea what was coming for them. The fire they started had burned away my flesh, but it had forged something unbreakable in its place. I gripped the handle of my crutch and stared into the dark room. The grief and the sorrow evaporated completely, leaving nothing behind but a cold and calculated focus. I knew exactly what I had to do next. The truth was a heavy burden to carry, but it was also the fuel I needed to keep going. I could not just walk into an insurance hearing with a burnt box and wild accusations against my father. Richard was a respected man in the community. He had lawyers and money and an entire congregation that believed his lies. I was just the crippled son living in the slums. I needed undeniable scientific proof. I needed someone who understood the anatomy of a fire just as well as I did, but who still had the license and the laboratory to back it up. I needed an ally. My mind went to Marcus. Marcus was a former colleague of mine back when I was still a rising star in the insurance adjustment firm. He was an independent arson investigator, now a man who lived and breathed chemical residue and thermal dynamics. He was also one of the few people who never treated me like a stepping stone. But before I could go to Marcus, I needed something for him to test. I could not show up empty-handed. 2 nights ago, under the cover of a moonless sky, I had forced myself to do the impossible. I had taken an expensive cab ride I could barely afford, using the last of my borrowed cash to get to the edge of the family estate. The place was barricaded with yellow caution tape and security fences, but it was vast, and I knew the blind spots. I had to drag my broken body through the wet grass, leaning heavily on my wooden crutches. Every step sent a jolt of white-hot pain up my crushed leg. My right arm was still bandaged tightly and aching with a relentless throb. But the physical agony was nothing compared to the phantom heat I felt when I looked at the blackened skeleton of the house. This was the exact spot where my father had locked me in. This was the ground where I was supposed to die so my brother could pay off his debts. I navigated through the debris using a small flashlight taped to my crutch. I made my way to what was left of the solvent storage cellar. The smell of wet ash and stale smoke choked my lungs. I knelt on the cold ground, ignoring the sharp rubble biting into my good knee. With my functioning hand, I used a small metal trowel to scrape the deep layers of soot from the concrete floor near the heavy steel door. I dug into the crevices where the water from the fire hoses could not wash away the chemical signature of the flames. I scooped the black powder into 3 separate sterile glass jars I had purchased from a pharmacy. I sealed them tightly. I packed them into my backpack and dragged myself back to the street. It took me 3 hours to make a journey that should have taken 10 minutes. By the time I returned to my slum apartment, I was shivering and covered in toxic filth, but I had my ammunition. Now I sat across from Marcus in his dimly lit independent laboratory on the industrial side of town. I had called him at dawn and begged for an hour of his time. When he saw me hobbling into his lab, his eyes widened with shock. The rumor around our old industry was that I had made a reckless mistake during the fire and ended up permanently disabled. That was the narrative my father had spun. Marcus pulled up a chair for me and poured me a cup of black coffee. I did not waste time with small talk. I placed the 3 sealed glass jars on his stainless steel workbench. I told him everything. I told him about the margin loans Thomas had taken out. I told him about the trust fund my grandfather had created. And I told him how my father had locked the cellar door and left me to burn. Marcus sat in complete silence for a long time. He stared at the jars of ash, and then he looked at my ruined leg. He was a man of science, a man who needed empirical evidence before he believed any story regardless of how tragic it was. He picked up the first jar and examined the dark soot clinging to the glass. He asked me if I was absolutely certain about the origin point of the fire. I told him I had reviewed the preliminary photographs and the V patterns were undeniable. They pointed directly to the solvent cellar. Marcus nodded slowly. He put on a pair of thick blue nitrile gloves and a pair of safety goggles. He carried the jars to his testing station and turned on the ventilation hood. I watched him work with a desperate hope tightening my chest. I knew that if Marcus found nothing, my entire case would fall apart. The trust documents were powerful, but without proof of arson, Richard could simply claim the fire was a tragic accident and tie the money up in court for years. Marcus extracted a small sample of the ash and placed it into a glass vial. He added a clear solvent to extract any unburned hydrocarbons. Then he placed the vial into a gas chromatograph mass spectrometer. It was a massive machine designed to separate and identify the exact chemical compounds present in a sample. The machine hummed to life. We sat in the lab waiting for the computer to generate the graph. The silence between us was heavy. The minutes dragged on like hours. I stared at the screen, watching the digital lines pulse as the machine processed the soot I had dug out of the ruins of my life. Finally, the computer beeped. Marcus leaned close to the monitor. He traced his finger along a series of tall, jagged peaks on the graph. He pulled up a reference database and compared the chemical signature from my sample to known accelerants. He turned to me and took off his safety goggles. His face was pale and his expression was grim. He told me that residential fires usually leave behind traces of common household materials like burning wood or melting plastic or natural gas. But the sample I brought him contained heavy concentrations of an industrial-grade accelerant. Specifically, it was a highly volatile synthetic hydrocarbon mixture used almost exclusively in commercial demolition and heavy machinery clearing. It was not something you would ever find in a normal household. It was not a cleaning solvent, it was a military-grade ignition fluid. Marcus printed the report and slammed it down on the table. He said the only way this specific chemical could have gotten into the center of a locked concrete cellar was if someone deliberately poured it there and sparked it. The fire burned so hot and so fast because the accelerant was designed to completely obliterate whatever it touched. The evidence was irrefutable. My father had purchased a specialized chemical accelerant, sneaked it into the house, poured it into the cellar, and ignited it. Marcus looked me directly in the eyes and told me he was officially stamping the report with his professional seal. He said he would testify in any court and stand before any insurance board to verify the results. I had my ally. I had the scientific sword I needed to cut through my father's web of lies. I thanked Marcus and carefully folded the certified laboratory report into my jacket pocket, right next to the original trust fund documents. For the first time since the night of the fire, I felt a genuine surge of power. I was no longer a helpless victim at the mercy of my family. I was a man armed with the truth. I left the laboratory and hailed a cheap taxi to take me back to my apartment. I needed to plan my exact entry into the insurance claim hearing scheduled for the following Friday. I needed to orchestrate my revenge with the same cold precision my father had used to plan my murder. But when I finally reached my rundown boarding house in the slums, I immediately realized something was wrong. The heavy wooden door to my apartment was slightly ajar. I gripped my crutch tightly and pushed the door open, bracing myself for an ambush. The room was empty, but the air felt disturbed. Someone had been inside. I hobbled over to the small kitchen table. Resting dead center on the scratched wood was a thick envelope made of expensive cream-colored paper. The return address, printed in embossed gold lettering, belonged to one of the most ruthless and expensive corporate law firms in the city, the firm my father retained for his personal business. I set my crutch against the wall and ripped the envelope open with my good hand. Inside was a formal cease and desist warning. The legal jargon was dense and aggressive, but the message was crystal clear. Richard was striking preemptively. The letter stated that I was engaging in a pattern of targeted harassment against my father and my brother. It claimed that my traumatic brain injury from the fire had caused me to become mentally unstable and prone to paranoid delusions. It explicitly accused me of trespassing on the burned estate and attempting to extort money from my grieving family. But the final paragraph was the true trap. The lawyers had drafted a formal injunction forbidding me from coming within 500 feet of Richard or Thomas. Furthermore, they had sent a copy of this injunction to the Central Insurance Board. The letter stated in bold, aggressive text that I was legally banned from attending the final insurance claim hearing next Friday. If I stepped foot inside that glass building, the security team had strict orders to detain me, and the local police would immediately arrest me for violating a standing harassment order. Richard was threatening to throw his disabled son into a jail cell just to ensure his massive payout went through without a hitch. I dropped the letter onto the table and let out a harsh, bitter laugh. The audacity of the man was almost impressive. Richard knew I was digging. He must have realized I had visited the property, or perhaps someone saw me climbing out of the taxi. He knew I would not just roll over and accept my fate, so he used his massive wealth to build a legal wall around himself. He thought a piece of expensive paper and the threat of a prison cell would terrify me into submission. He thought I was still the obedient son who would back down when the patriarch raised his voice. He wanted me to feel trapped. He wanted me to believe that all my escape routes were permanently blocked and that I had no choice but to surrender to my miserable life in the slums. The old David, the man who craved his father's approval, might have surrendered. The old David would have looked at that legal threat and felt paralyzed by fear. But that man died in the fire. The man standing in this apartment had absolutely nothing left to lose and everything to avenge. I picked up the cease and desist letter and calmly crumpled it into a tight ball. I threw it into the trash can next to the sink. Let him ban me from the hearing. Let him hire the most expensive security guards in the city. Let him draft all the legal threats his lawyers could type. It did not matter. Next Friday at noon, Richard and Thomas were going to walk into that insurance boardroom, expecting to collect a check for $980,000. They were going to smile and shake hands and pack their bags for a luxury vacation. They thought they had secured their perfect crime, but they were blind to the avalanche hanging right above their heads. They did not know about the original trust documents resting in my pocket. They did not know about the military-grade accelerant report certified by an independent arson investigator. And they certainly did not know that a piece of paper threatening jail time was not going to stop me from walking through those glass doors. The stage was set for the ultimate confrontation, and Richard had just handed me the final piece of motivation I needed to destroy him completely. The silence in my slum apartment was suddenly shattered by a frantic knocking at my front door. I had just finished crumpling Richard's legal threat into a ball, and my mind was still racing with strategies for the upcoming hearing. The rain was lashing against the thin glass of my single window, creating a steady drumbeat that matched the heavy pounding on the wooden door. I gripped my wooden crutch tightly and pulled myself up from the cheap kitchen chair. Every movement sent a jolt of pain through my damaged leg, but I ignored it. I thought it might be one of Thomas's hired thugs, or perhaps another debt collector. I braced myself for a fight. I unlocked the deadbolt with my good hand and pulled the door open. The person standing in the dimly lit hallway was the absolute last person I ever expected to see. It was Rebecca, my ex-wife. She stood there dripping wet from the rain, but she had clearly spent hours getting ready. Her hair was perfectly styled, and she was wearing the expensive trench coat I had bought for her last anniversary. The air in the hallway was instantly filled with the scent of her sweet floral perfume. It was a smell that used to bring me comfort after a long day at the insurance firm. Now it just made my stomach turn. I stared at her in complete disbelief. This was the same woman who had stood in the corner of my hospital room while my father called me a crippled burden. This was the same woman who had looked at my bandaged body, my third-degree burns, and my shattered future, and decided I was no longer worth her time. She had silently slipped her wedding ring off her finger, left a draft divorce paper on the cold hospital tray, and walked out of my life without shedding a single tear. Yet here she was, standing outside my rundown apartment in the slums, crying as if her heart was breaking. "Oh, David," she sobbed, reaching out to touch my arm. I stepped back quickly, refusing to let her hands near me. Her fingers hovered in the air before she pulled them back to wipe the tears streaming down her face. "I have been so incredibly foolish, David. I have not been able to sleep for weeks. Every single night I lie awake thinking about what I did to you. I was scared. I was terrified of the medical bills and the uncertainty, but I was so wrong. I should never have left your side. Please, David, you have to believe me. I want to come back. I want to take care of you." I stood completely still, leaning on my crutch, letting her words hang in the damp air. The old David would have melted. The old David, the man who was desperately starved for love and validation in a family that treated him like dirt, would have pulled her inside and forgiven her instantly. But that man had burned away in the inferno. I looked into her eyes, and I saw right through the theatrical performance. Her tears were real, but they were not tears of regret. They were tears of pure, unadulterated greed. It did not take a genius to figure out exactly why she had suddenly grown a conscience. Rebecca was a highly active member of the local church community. It was the exact same church where my father served on the council. The same church where the pastors had gathered in the hospital waiting room to praise Thomas while I was fighting for my life in the intensive care unit. In circles like that, secrets do not stay buried for long. Someone must have talked. A legal clerk, a gossiping board member, or maybe one of the bank managers had let slip that the burned estate did not belong to Richard. They must have whispered about a massive trust fund established by my grandfather. They must have realized that the disabled son living in the slums was actually the sole beneficiary of a fortune worth millions. Rebecca had done the math. She had realized that the man she abandoned in a hospital bed was about to become the wealthiest member of the entire family, and she wanted her seat back on the throne. I felt a surge of hot anger rise in my chest. I wanted to scream at her. I wanted to list every single agonizing night I had spent alone in this freezing apartment, crying from the pain of my nerve damage while she was out living her life. I wanted to slam the heavy wooden door right in her perfectly manicured face, but I stopped myself. I took a slow, deep breath. My grandfather had always taught me to look at the entire chessboard before making a move. Rebecca was a leech, but right now she was a highly motivated leech. She was standing in front of me, desperate to prove her loyalty, and I needed a weapon. I needed the final piece of evidence to completely destroy Richard and Thomas at the insurance hearing. I relaxed my posture and let my shoulders slump. I manufactured a look of vulnerability and deep exhaustion. I looked down at the floor as if I was overwhelmed by emotion. "Rebecca," I said, keeping my voice low and unsteady. "You have no idea how much it hurt when you walked out that door. I was entirely alone. I had absolutely nothing left." "I know, David," she cried, stepping eagerly into the apartment. She closed the door behind her and moved closer. "I was a coward, but I am here now. I will do whatever it takes to make it right. Just tell me what you need. I will cook for you. I will help you with your physical therapy. We can be a family again." I slowly raised my head and met her gaze. "I need to know I can trust you, Rebecca. I need to know you are actually on my side because my own family is trying to destroy me." I told her a carefully constructed lie, heavily laced with the truth. I told her that my grandfather had left me a substantial amount of money in a trust fund. Her eyes instantly widened at the confirmation of the rumor. The greed flashed in her pupils like a neon sign, but she tried to mask it with a look of supportive concern. I continued my story. I explained that Richard and Thomas were trying to steal the trust fund by submitting a fraudulent insurance claim. I told her that Thomas had the official submission documents locked away in his private real estate office. I said that unless I could get my hands on a physical copy of that specific insurance claim, I was going to lose everything. I would be stuck in this slum forever, and Thomas would walk away with my entire inheritance. "If you really want to prove that you love me, Rebecca, if you really want to share my life and my future, I need your help. I cannot walk properly. I cannot get into Thomas's building. But you can. You still have the security passcode to his real estate office from when you worked there as a consultant. I need you to go there tonight. I need you to get into his filing cabinet and bring me a copy of the final insurance claim document Richard submitted." Rebecca hesitated. The color drained from her face as she processed what I was asking her to do. Breaking into Thomas's office was a massive risk. If she was caught, she could face criminal charges. But then I saw the gears turning in her mind. I saw her weighing the risk of a breaking and entering charge against the guaranteed reward of a multi-million-dollar trust fund. She looked around my pathetic apartment, and then she looked at me. She imagined the luxury cars, the designer clothes, the lavish vacations. She made her choice. "I will do it," she said, her voice suddenly firm and resolute. "I will get you that file, David. I will prove to you that I am committed to us." I gave her the exact instructions. I told her which drawer Thomas used for his confidential financial records. I told her to look for a red folder labeled with the estate address. She nodded eagerly, memorizing every single detail. Before she left, she reached into her purse and pulled out a small velvet box. She opened it to reveal the diamond wedding ring she had abandoned at the hospital. She placed it gently on my kitchen table right next to the crumpled legal threat from my father. "Keep this here," she whispered. "When I come back with the file, I want you to put it back on my finger." I forced a weak smile and nodded. "I will be waiting, Rebecca." As soon as the door clicked shut behind her, the fake smile vanished from my face. I looked at the diamond ring resting on the table and felt absolutely nothing. No warmth, no nostalgia, no regret. I spent the next 4 hours pacing the small apartment, leaning heavily on my crutch. The rain continued to pour outside, mirroring the storm building inside my chest. I had the certified chemical report from Marcus proving the arson. I had the original trust documents proving my inheritance. But the copy of the submitted insurance claim was the ultimate kill shot. It would prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Richard and Thomas had legally committed federal fraud. Just past 2 in the morning, there was a soft, rapid knock at the door. I moved quickly across the room and unbolted the lock. Rebecca practically fell into the apartment. Her hair was soaked and she was breathing heavily. She was shaking from the adrenaline, but her eyes were shining with intense triumph. She reached inside her wet trench coat and pulled out a thick manila envelope. "I got it," she gasped, handing the envelope to me. He changed the passcode, but I remembered his mother's birthday. I got into the cabinet. "It is all there, David. Every single page of the claim Richard filed, including the forged signatures attempting to bypass the trust fund. I took the envelope from her trembling hands. I opened the flap and pulled out the thick stack of papers. I scanned the first few pages with my heart pounding against my ribs. It was perfect. Richard had detailed his absolute ownership of the property and formally requested the $980,000 payout to be wired directly into his personal account. It was a textbook case of wire fraud, insurance fraud, and grand larceny. My arsenal was finally complete. Rebecca took a step closer, completely ignoring her wet clothes. She looked up at me with a wide, expectant smile. She was waiting for her reward. She was waiting for me to pull her into a passionate embrace and welcome her back into my life. "I did it, David," she whispered. "We are going to be rich. We are going to get out of this horrible place. Now please put my ring back on my finger." I slowly lowered the documents. I looked at her flushed face and her eager, greedy eyes. I walked past her over to the kitchen table. I picked up the small velvet box containing the diamond wedding ring. I turned around and faced her. I held the ring up to the dim light of the apartment bulb. "You know, Rebecca," I said, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. When I was lying in that hospital bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the monitor's beep, I thought my life was over. I thought the fire had taken everything from me. But the truth is, the fire was the best thing that ever happened to me. It burned away the illusions. It showed me exactly who my father was. It showed me exactly who my brother was. And most importantly, it showed me exactly who you are. Her smile faltered. Confusion washed over her features. "David, what are you talking about?" I stepped toward her, leaning heavily on my wooden crutch. My posture was no longer slumped. I stood as tall as my broken body would allow. "You did not come back here tonight because you love me, Rebecca. You came back because you heard the church gossiping about a trust fund. You came back because you smelled money. You left me when I was a crippled liability, and you only returned when I became a winning lottery ticket." She started to panic. She reached out her hands desperately, trying to grab my arm. "No, David, that is not true. I swear to you. I realized I made a mistake. I brought you the file. I risked going to jail for you. You risked going to jail for yourself," I corrected her coldly. "I needed this document to destroy my family, and I knew you were greedy enough to do the dirty work for me. You proved your loyalty all right. You proved your loyalty to the highest bidder." I walked over to the cheap plastic trash can sitting in the corner of the kitchen. I looked down at the diamond ring resting in the velvet box. It represented a completely fake life, a hollow marriage built on shallow expectations and conditional love. Without a single second of hesitation, I dropped the ring into the trash can. It landed with a dull, pathetic thud among the coffee grounds and empty soup cans. Rebecca let out a sharp, horrified scream. "What are you doing? Are you insane?" I turned back to face her, gripping the stolen insurance file tightly in my hand. "I am finally seeing things clearly," I said. "Thank you for the delivery, Rebecca. Now get out of my apartment." She stood there, frozen in pure shock. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The realization of what had just happened crashed over her like a physical wave. She had broken into a private office and stolen legal documents not to secure her future, but to hand me the very weapon I needed to leave her behind forever. She had been completely and utterly outplayed. "Get out," I repeated, my voice echoing loudly in the small room. Tears of genuine rage and humiliation finally spilled down her cheeks. She backed away toward the door, her chest heaving with heavy, angry sobs. "You are going to regret this, David," she spat, her voice trembling with venom. "You are a crippled, broken man, and you are going to die completely alone." "I might be broken," I replied calmly, walking toward the door to hold it open for her. "But I will never be a victim again." She practically ran out into the hallway, sobbing uncontrollably. I did not wait for her to turn around. I slammed the heavy wooden door shut with a resounding crack that vibrated through the floorboards. I twisted the deadbolt, locking her out in the cold, damp hallway forever. I stood alone in the quiet apartment, listening to the rain beat against the window. My crushed leg throbbed and my bandaged arm ached, but I felt lighter than I had in years. I walked over to the kitchen table and placed the stolen insurance file next to the certified arson report and the original trust fund documents. The holy trinity of revenge was finally complete. Richard had sent a letter threatening to throw me in jail if I attended the hearing. He thought he had completely neutralized the threat. He thought he had silenced the crippled son for good. But he had no idea that I had just gathered enough ammunition to obliterate his entire existence. The conflict had escalated to its absolute peak, and there was no turning back. I stared at the stack of documents on the table and allowed myself a cold, tight smile. Friday was going to be a very interesting day. The towering glass structure of the Central Insurance headquarters reflected the morning sun like a giant mirror. It was a cold and intimidating building designed to make ordinary people feel incredibly small. But as I stood on the pavement outside, leaning heavily against my wooden crutch, I did not feel small. I felt like a man holding a lit match standing over a mountain of dry gasoline. The physical pain in my crushed leg was a constant agonizing throb. Every step I took sent jagged spikes of agony up my spine, but I welcomed the pain today. The pain kept me focused. It reminded me of the burning beams of the estate and the smell of the military-grade accelerant. It reminded me of the hospital bed where I woke up to find my life destroyed and my family laughing. I pushed through the heavy revolving doors of the lobby. The air conditioning inside was freezing, but I was sweating under my cheap faded jacket. I had intentionally worn the exact same clothes I had on the day Thomas threw me out onto the street. I wanted them to see the beggar they had created. I wanted them to look at my scarred hands and my twisted leg. I wanted them to see the exact product of their endless greed. I navigated the polished marble floors, making my way toward the private executive elevators. Through the thick glass walls of the VIP waiting area, I saw them. My blood ran completely cold. Richard Thomas and Chloe were standing together in a tight circle, radiating an aura of absolute arrogance. They looked like they had just won the lottery. Richard was wearing a flawless, custom-tailored Italian suit that probably cost more than my entire annual rent in the slums. His silver hair was perfectly swept back, and his posture was straight and proud. He was playing the role of the tragic but resilient patriarch recovering from a devastating family fire. Next to him stood Thomas and Chloe. They were dressed in matching designer resort wear, looking completely ridiculous inside a corporate office. Thomas had a pair of expensive sunglasses tucked into his silk shirt and a massive gold watch gleaming on his wrist. Chloe was clutching a limited edition leather handbag that I knew she had purchased on a credit card they could not actually afford. But what made my stomach physically turn were the 3 massive luxury suitcases sitting right beside them. They had packed their bags for a tropical vacation. They were literally planning to take the $980,000 insurance check walk straight out of this building and head directly to the airport for a first-class flight to Hawaii. They were celebrating a victory built on my attempted murder. I stood out of sight behind a marble pillar watching them laugh. I could hear the smug tone in my father's voice as he spoke to a passing receptionist. He was charming and polite, weaving a flawless web of deception. He had spent his entire life mastering the art of the fake smile. I watched Thomas check his gold watch and tap his foot impatiently. Thomas was sweating slightly, likely thinking about the aggressive margin loans that would finally be wiped clean today. They were so incredibly confident. They truly believed that the ashes of the estate had buried all their sins. They believed that the crippled son in the slums was too broken and too pathetic to ever fight back. I watched them gather their expensive suitcases and follow a junior executive toward the main boardroom. The time had come. I tightened my grip on the handle of my crutch. Inside my jacket pocket, I could feel the stiff paper of the original trust fund document and the certified arson report. The documents felt heavy and warm against my chest. I gave them exactly 2 minutes to settle into the room before I made my move. I wanted them to taste the money. I wanted them to be inches away from signing the final release forms before I ripped the ground out from under their feet. I walked down the long carpeted hallway leading to the executive claims boardroom. The sound of my wooden crutch hitting the floor echoed loudly in the quiet corridor. Thud, drag, thud, drag. Every step was a countdown to their absolute destruction. When I reached the heavy double oak doors, I did not bother knocking. I did not ask for permission to enter. I raised my good arm and shoved the doors open with every ounce of physical strength I had left in my body. The heavy doors crashed against the walls with a thunderous bang. The entire room froze instantly. The executive claims boardroom was massive, featuring a long mahogany table surrounded by black leather chairs. At the far end of the table sat the head of the insurance claims department and 2 senior legal advisors. They had stacks of final settlement papers spread out in front of them with a golden pen waiting to be used. And sitting right in the center of the room, looking incredibly smug and triumphant, were Richard Thomas and Chloe. Their heads snapped toward the doorway. The fake corporate smiles on their faces vanished so quickly it was almost comical. The silence in the room was absolute. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. All eyes were locked on the crippled man standing in the doorway wearing cheap clothes and leaning on a piece of wood. I stepped over the threshold. My gaze was locked entirely on my father. I did not look at the insurance executives. I did not look at Thomas, who was suddenly gripping the arms of his leather chair so tightly his knuckles were turning white. I looked directly into the eyes of the man who had locked me inside a burning room. My eyes were burning with a terrifying fire, and I made sure he saw every single flame. "What the hell is this?" Richard finally shouted, breaking the silence. His voice cracked with a mixture of shock and immediate fury. The charming patriarch mask slipped away instantly, revealing the cold and ruthless monster underneath. I took another slow step into the room, dragging my ruined leg behind me. "I am here for the hearing," I said. My voice was calm and steady, carrying across the large room without a single tremor. "I am a member of this family, and I have a right to be here." Richard stood up so fast his heavy leather chair scraped violently against the floor. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. "You have absolutely no rights here, you pathetic creature. How did you even get past the security desk? I sent you a legal warning. I told you I would have you thrown in a prison cell if you ever harassed this family again." Thomas jumped up nervously next to him. "Dad, call the police right now. He is stalking us. He is completely unhinged. Look at him. He looks like a homeless person who wandered in off the street. He is going to ruin everything." Chloe scoffed loudly from her seat, crossing her arms in pure disgust. "This is so incredibly embarrassing," she muttered, rolling her eyes at the insurance executives. "I am so sorry, gentlemen. My brother-in-law suffered a very tragic brain injury during the fire. He has not been in his right mind since. He is just extremely jealous of our family. Please just call the guards and have him removed so we can finish signing our paperwork and catch our flight." The head of the insurance claims department, a stern older man with gray hair, adjusted his glasses and looked at me with deep concern. "Sir, this is a highly confidential financial settlement meeting. You are not listed as a primary policy holder on this account. I must ask you to leave the premises immediately, or I will be forced to alert building security." I did not take my eyes off Richard. I took one more step forward, planting myself firmly at the opposite end of the long mahogany table. "I am not leaving," I said. "And you are not signing any checks today." Richard's face turned a deep shade of purple. The veins in his neck were bulging as he completely lost control of his temper. He slammed both of his hands down on the polished wood table. "Listen to me, you worthless, crippled beggar dog," he screamed, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "You are nothing but a burden. You have always been a massive disappointment to this family. You rushed into that fire like a stupid blind animal and ruined your own life. And now you crawl out of your filthy slum apartment to come here and beg for our money. You want a handout because your pathetic wife left you and you cannot afford your medical bills. Well, you are getting absolutely nothing, Not a single dime. Thomas laughed, a sharp, nervous sound that betrayed his internal panic. Give it up, David. You are making a massive fool of yourself. Just turn around and hobble back to your miserable little rat hole before we actually press charges. You do not belong in a room like this with people like us. We are moving on to a better life, and you are just dead weight. I stood tall against my crutch, letting their toxic insults wash over me. A few weeks ago, those words would have broken me. A few weeks ago, being called a beggar dog by my own father in front of a room full of powerful executives would have shattered my soul and sent me running away in tears. But today, their words meant absolutely nothing. They were just the desperate barking of trapped animals who did not yet realize the cage door had been completely sealed shut. Richard turned his attention back to the head of claims. His voice was dripping with venom and false authority. I demand that you call your security team this instant. I will not have this momentous occasion ruined by a psychotic homeless cripple. He is a danger to himself and a danger to my family. Have him dragged out of this building and thrown onto the street where he belongs. We have a $980,000 settlement to finalize, and I will not wait another second. The insurance executive sighed and reached for the black telephone sitting on the center console. I am sorry, sir, he said, looking at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance. But you leave me no choice. I am calling the guards. I watched the executive pick up the phone receiver. I watched Richard cross his arms and smirk with absolute triumph, believing he had completely won. I watched Thomas and Chloe whisper to each other and glance over at their luxury suitcases, completely ready to grab the money and run. They were standing at the absolute peak of their arrogance. They were looking down at me from what they thought was an untouchable mountain of wealth and power. I took a deep breath. The fiery gaze in my eyes hardened into cold steel. It was finally time to burn their mountain to the ground. The hand of the senior insurance executive hovered right above the receiver of the black telephone. His finger was just a fraction of an inch away from pressing the emergency button to summon the building's security team. Richard was practically vibrating with smug satisfaction. My father stood there with his chest puffed out fully, believing that he had completely neutralized me. He thought the heavy glass doors of the boardroom would simply swallow me up and spit me back out onto the street where I belonged. He thought I was just a desperate, injured animal crawling on a wooden crutch to beg for scraps from his grand victory. I did not look at my father. I locked my eyes firmly on the executive sitting at the head of the long mahogany table. I knew him. Before the fire, before the nerve damage and the agonizing skin grafts and the endless nights of despair in the slum apartment, I had built a formidable career in this exact industry. I was a senior forensic claims adjuster. I had a reputation for untangling the most complex insurance frauds in the city. Arthur, I said, my voice slicing through the tense silence of the massive room. You know exactly who I am. You know my reputation. And you know I would never walk into your boardroom unless I had absolute proof of what I am about to say. The executive froze. Arthur Miller narrowed his eyes behind his wire-rimmed glasses and stared at me intensely. He looked past the cheap clothes and the heavy bandages and the scarred tissue on my face. He recognized me. We had worked together on a massive corporate fraud case 5 years ago. He had personally praised my analytical skills and my unbreakable integrity. Arthur slowly pulled his hand away from the telephone. The immediate threat of security vanished from the room. Richard noticed the shift in the atmosphere, and his smug smile completely evaporated. "What are you doing?" Richard demanded, turning his furious gaze toward Arthur. "Call the guards right now. I am the client here. I am the victim of a tragic fire, and this man is a deranged trespasser. He is my son, but he has lost his mind. Do not let him stall this settlement for another second." Arthur raised a single hand and held it flat in the air. The gesture was a silent but absolute command for Richard to shut his mouth. Arthur did not even look at my father. His eyes remained fixed entirely on me. "David," he said, his voice measured and professional. "I was told you were permanently incapacitated in the fire. Your father submitted medical documentation stating you were in a state of severe cognitive decline and could not be consulted regarding the estate. I let out a low, cold laugh that echoed off the thick glass walls of the boardroom. My father has submitted a lot of creative fiction to this company, Arthur. I am standing right here. My body might be broken, but my mind has never been sharper, and I brought exactly what you need to see before you sign away nearly $1 million of your company funds to a criminal. Richard lunged forward, pointing a trembling finger right at my face. You ungrateful parasite, he screamed, losing every ounce of his carefully cultivated charm. I will have you thrown in a federal prison for this. You are trying to extort me. I ignored his desperate outburst. I stepped up to the edge of the pristine mahogany table, leaning all of my weight onto my wooden crutch. The physical pain in my crushed leg was roaring, but I barely felt it. The adrenaline in my veins was absolute. I reached into the deep pocket of my faded jacket with my one good hand. I pulled out the charred and rusted tin box. The exact same box Richard had ordered his servant to throw at my face. I slammed it down onto the center of the polished wooden table. The heavy metal made a loud cracking sound. A small cloud of black ash puffed out from the edges of the box and settled onto the expensive mahogany. Chloe let out a dramatic gasp of disgust, stepping backward and clutching her designer handbag as if the ash might somehow infect her. I reached back into my jacket and pulled out the thick stack of pristine yellow documents that I had meticulously salvaged from the fireproof military bags inside that box. I dropped them directly in front of Arthur Miller. Following the old documents, I pulled out the certified laboratory report I had obtained from Marcus. The thick packet was stamped with the official seal of an independent arson investigator. I placed it right next to the charred box. Finally, I reached into my inner shirt pocket and withdrew the manila envelope that Rebecca had stolen from Thomas just 2 nights ago. The exact copy of the fraudulent insurance claim my father had tried to slip through the system. I dropped it on top of the pile like the final nail in a coffin. The physical weight of the evidence sitting on the table seemed to suck all the air out of the boardroom. Thomas was staring at the manila envelope. His face turned the color of wet chalk. He recognized his own confidential office folders. He knew exactly what was inside that envelope, and he knew that his carefully constructed facade of a wealthy real estate investor was about to be ripped apart. Arthur leaned forward and picked up the yellow documents first. What am I looking at, David? He asked, carefully examining the official seals and the signatures at the bottom of the pages. You are looking at the true legacy of my grandfather, I stated loudly, making sure my voice carried to every corner of the room. You are looking at the original, unedited, and legally binding documentation of the family trust fund. Richard sneered, attempting to regain his posture. He straightened his expensive Italian suit jacket and let out a forced patronizing sigh. That is nothing but ancient garbage, he declared, waving his hand dismissively. My father was a paranoid old man. He drafted dozens of useless papers before he died. I am the eldest son. The estate passed directly to me. I have the property deeds. I have the insurance policy in my name. This is a pathetic attempt to steal my tragic payout. I turned my head slowly and locked my eyes on my father. He looked so incredibly desperate. His arrogance was cracking under the weight of the unknown. This land was never yours, Richard. I snarled. My voice was no longer calm. It was thick with years of accumulated rage and the raw agony of his betrayal. You walked around that beautiful estate for years acting like you were the king of the world. You treated everyone around you like disposable garbage. You treated me like a useless burden. But the truth is, you were nothing but a glorified tenant. My grandfather saw right through you. He knew you were greedy. He knew you had absolutely no moral compass. He knew that the second he died, you would liquidate the family history to fund your own selfish desires. Richard opened his mouth to speak, but I cut him off, stepping closer and forcing him to look at the documents. My grandfather legally barricaded the entire property inside an ironclad trust. You never owned the house. You never owned the land. And most importantly, you never owned the rights to the insurance policy. The policy you are trying to cash out today was automatically activated under the name of the trust fund. Arthur Miller flipped to the final page of the yellowed legal document. His eyes scanned the dense paragraphs of legal text. He traced his finger along a specific line, and then he looked up at me in absolute shock. "David is correct," Arthur announced, his voice ringing with absolute authority. According to the original articles of the trust, which were filed and sealed before his passing, the grandfather explicitly bypassed Richard. The document clearly names David as the sole legal beneficiary of all physical assets and all financial distributions, including insurance payouts in the event of a total loss. The entire boardroom went completely still. The silence was deafening. Chloe dropped her designer handbag onto the floor. It hit the carpet with a soft thud. She stared at Richard with wide, panicked eyes. Thomas grabbed the edge of the mahogany table, swaying slightly on his feet. The margin loans, the millions of dollars in debt, the threat of prison. It all came crashing down on him in a single, devastating wave. "No," Richard whispered, shaking his head frantically. "No, that is impossible. That is a forgery. I was the heir. He told me I was the heir. You are lying. You are all lying to me." I did not stop. I did not give him a single second to breathe. I pointed my finger at the certified laboratory report sitting on the table. "But stealing my inheritance was not enough for you, was it?" I continued, stepping directly into his personal space. "You realized Thomas was drowning in debt. You realized your golden boy, the son you paraded around while you ignored my existence, was a complete and utter fraud. You needed liquid cash to save him from federal prison, but you could not sell the house because the trust blocked you. You needed the fire insurance payout, and you knew deep down that the money would only go to the true beneficiary." Richard began to sweat profusely. He backed away from me, bumping into his own leather chair. "Shut up!" he hissed, gripping his chest. "Shut your mouth right now. You bought industrial-grade military accelerant," I shouted, letting the absolute horror of his crimes fill the room. "You took your exclusive key to the solvent storage cellar, the cellar nobody else could access. You poured that chemical all over the floor, and you set the fire. You deliberately burned down the only home I ever knew to get your hands on $980,000. Arthur Miller tore open the laboratory report. He read the chemical analysis provided by Marcus. He saw the undeniable proof of the synthetic hydrocarbon mixture. He saw the independent certification proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that the fire was a targeted, catastrophic act of arson. "But the worst part," I said, lowering my voice to a terrifying whisper. "The worst part, Richard, is that you locked the cellar door and trapped me inside. You knew I was sleeping right above the blast zone. You knew I would try to save you. You stood on the lawn and watched the roof collapse on top of me. You watched me burn, and you smiled because you thought my death was the final signature you needed on your fake insurance claim. You did not just commit arson. You committed attempted murder against your own son." Richard looked completely cornered. He darted his eyes wildly around the boardroom, looking for an exit, looking for anyone who would believe his lies. But there was no escape. He had walked himself directly into a steel trap. Arthur Miller stood up from his chair. His face was a mask of pure corporate fury and disgust. He gathered all the documents, the original trust, the arson report, and the stolen fraudulent claim file. He squared the papers perfectly on the table and looked directly at Richard. Mr. Richard Arthur announced, his voice booming with undeniable finality. "Based on the irrefutable evidence of financial fraud, document forgery, and deliberate catastrophic arson, your request for the claim is officially canceled. You have absolutely no legal standing in this building, and you have no right to a single penny of this money." Richard let out a strangled, gasping sound. He reached his hands out toward the paperwork as if he could somehow magically change the words on the page. Furthermore, Arthur continued, his voice devoid of any sympathy. "The $980,000 account will be immediately and irrevocably transferred into the legal trust managed solely by Mr. David. The funds belong entirely to him." The reality of the situation struck Richard like a physical blow. The money was gone. The absolute fortune he had burned his home for, the fortune he had mutilated his son to steal, was now resting safely in my hands. The lavish Hawaiian vacation, the designer suits, the arrogant pride, it was all completely vaporized. But Arthur was not finished. He picked up his black telephone and dialed a short extension. "Security," he said, keeping his eyes locked on my father. "Seal the boardroom doors immediately. Do not let anyone leave." Arthur placed the phone back down and delivered the ultimate execution. "The legal department of this insurance firm has a zero-tolerance policy for arson and attempted murder. This entire case, including all the evidence your son has provided, has already been forwarded to the federal police. They are waiting for you in the lobby right now." Richard let out a raw, agonizing scream of absolute despair. It was not a scream of anger. It was the pathetic, terrifying wail of a man who realized his entire life was over. He collapsed into his leather chair, burying his face in his hands, pulling at his own silver hair. The illusion of his power was shattered into a million sharp pieces. Behind him, the pressure was too much. Thomas looked at his father, listening to the agonizing screams, and realized that he was going to prison for the margin fraud, and his father was going to prison for arson. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. Thomas let out a weak, shallow breath, his eyes rolling into the back of his head. His knees buckled completely. He collapsed, falling hard onto the heavy glass floor of the boardroom with a sickening thud. I stood at the edge of the mahogany table, leaning heavily on my wooden crutch. The physical pain in my leg was entirely gone, replaced by a profound and overwhelming sense of absolute victory. I watched them crumble into the ashes of their own greed. The trap had sprung flawlessly, and the checkmate was absolute. I did not have to lift another finger. The trap had closed, and the sheer weight of their own greed did the rest of the work. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open, and 3 federal agents walked inside. Their faces were stern, and their badges reflected the harsh fluorescent light of the ceiling. They bypassed me completely and walked straight toward my father. Richard tried to stand, but his legs gave way. He tried to use his charming voice to negotiate, to explain that this was all a massive misunderstanding, but the agents did not care. They grabbed his arms and pulled them firmly behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs echoed through the silent room. It was the sound of an empire falling apart. Arthur Miller sat at the head of the table, watching coldly as the man who had tried to defraud his company was detained. The other executives packed up their briefcases and walked out, refusing to even look at my father. Richard was sweating profusely, and his expensive, custom-tailored Italian suit suddenly looked wrinkled and cheap. The agents marched Richard out of the boardroom, and I followed slowly behind them, dragging my wooden crutch against the thick carpet. I wanted to watch every single second of his downfall. We moved down the long corridor and entered the massive glass lobby of the insurance building. It was the middle of the day, and the lobby was crowded with corporate executives, wealthy investors, and important clients. These were the exact same high society people Richard had spent his entire life trying to impress. They all stopped and stared. The respected elder, the flawless patriarch, the man who demanded absolute obedience from everyone around him, was being dragged through the lobby like a common street criminal. The federal agents loudly read him his rights, listing the charges of federal wire fraud, massive insurance fraud, and the attempted murder of his own son. The whispers began immediately rippling through the large crowd. People pointed and stared as his perfect facade completely crumbled into dust. He looked back at me one last time before they shoved him through the revolving doors. There was no anger left in his eyes, only absolute, pure terror. He knew he was going to spend the rest of his life inside a concrete cell. Thomas did not fare any better. He was still sitting on the floor of the boardroom, clutching his chest and hyperventilating when the police came to escort him out for questioning. His luxury vacation to Hawaii was over before it even began. Within 48 hours, the banks received wind of the federal investigation and the canceled insurance payout. They completely froze his accounts and initiated an aggressive seizure of all his remaining assets. The margin loans he had used to fake his wealthy lifestyle instantly defaulted. I heard from a former colleague that the repo men showed up at his luxury penthouse while he was still sitting on the couch in a state of catatonic shock. They took the expensive cars, they took the imported furniture, and they took every single piece of artwork he had used to convince the world he was a success. He tried to call his rich friends for a bailout, but nobody answered the phone. He was stripped completely bare. He had spent his entire life mocking me for being a failure and treating me like garbage, but now he was the one being thrown out onto the street without a single dollar to his name. The poetic justice was absolute. He had evicted me and forced me into the slums, and now he was facing the exact same fate, but with the crushing weight of a multi-million-dollar debt that he would spend the rest of his miserable life trying to pay off. And Chloe was exactly the kind of person I always knew she was. The moment the banks froze the accounts and the repo men knocked on the door, her loyalty completely evaporated. She did not stay to comfort her husband. She did not offer to help him rebuild or find a way out of the mess. She realized the money was gone, and she immediately packed her bags. She complained loudly that the repo men were scuffing her designer shoes as she stuffed the last remaining expensive dresses and limited edition handbags into her luxury luggage. She forced Thomas to sign divorce papers right there in the empty living room, threatening to testify against him in court regarding his financial crimes if he refused. She walked out the door, climbed into a waiting car, and never looked back, leaving him completely alone, weeping on the bare floor of an empty, repossessed apartment. The people who had laughed at me, the people who had called me a crippled child and a worthless burden, were now penniless. They had built their entire lives on a fragile foundation of lies, theft, and immense arrogance, and it took almost nothing to bring it all crashing down. I did not feel sorry for them. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or remorse. They had orchestrated their own destruction from the very beginning. My father had literally set the fire that burned his life to the ground. He had handed me the very tools I needed to expose him when he threw that rusted box at my face, thinking it was trash. Thomas had dug his own grave with his endless vanity and his desperate need to look wealthy. I did not destroy them. I simply stepped out of their way and let reality crush them. I stood in my small apartment a few days later and watched the local news channel cover the spectacular downfall of the great Richard and his real estate mogul son. The news anchors detailed the fraud and the arson and the twisted plot to steal a trust fund from a disabled relative. The entire city knew the truth now. The dark shadow they had cast over my life for 30 years was finally gone. I was physically broken, but my spirit was entirely intact. I was finally free. 6 months have passed since the heavy glass doors of the insurance boardroom closed on my past. Today, the air is crisp and cold. I am standing on the exact same plot of land where my family estate once stood. The blackened wood and the twisted metal and the toxic ash are completely gone. I hired a crew to clear every single piece of rubble from the ground. It took weeks of back-breaking labor to scrape away the physical scars of my father's crime. I watched the bulldozers carry away the remnants of the solvent cellar where the inferno began. Now, there is only fresh soil and the quiet rustle of the wind through the old oak trees that survived the fire. I lean on my wooden crutch and breathe in the clean air. My crushed leg still aches when the weather turns cold, and the burned scars on my arm will never completely fade. I will never walk perfectly again. I will never look the same. But standing here on this cleared earth, I have never felt more powerful or more whole. The $980,000 insurance check did not go toward buying designer suits or luxury cars or first-class tickets to Hawaii. It did not go toward creating a fake illusion of wealth to impress strangers who do not care about me. That money was the final gift from a grandfather who saw my true potential when everyone else looked at me and saw nothing but a shadow. I used a portion of those funds to begin restoring the land. We are not building a massive mansion to isolate ourselves from the world. We are building a modest, sustainable home. A place built on a foundation of absolute truth rather than a fragile basement filled with explosive secrets and toxic lies. Every wooden beam and every brick laid on this property is a testament to the man who built the original empire. He believed in earning your place in the world, and I intend to honor that philosophy for the rest of my life. But a legacy is not just about bricks and dirt. A true legacy is about what you leave behind for the people who need it most. When I was lying in that hospital bed covered in bandages and drowning in medical debt, I felt a level of despair that I would not wish on my worst enemy. I knew exactly what it felt like to have your body broken and your livelihood snatched away in an instant. I knew what it felt like to be looked at with absolute disgust simply because I had lost my physical ability to work. I refused to let that pain mean nothing. I took the vast majority of the trust fund settlement and established a dedicated financial support network. The foundation is specifically designed to support victims of sudden catastrophic accidents who have lost their ability to provide for themselves. We help them pay the crippling medical bills that insurance companies refuse to cover. We provide resources for intense physical therapy and vocational retraining. We give them the financial anchor they need to rebuild their lives when the world tells them they are a worthless burden. Just last week, I handed a grant to a young construction worker who had lost his arm in an industrial accident. His employer had abandoned him, and his landlord was threatening to evict him. I looked him directly in the eyes, and I told him that his life was not over. I told him that his worth was not tied to his physical perfection. Seeing the hope return to his face was worth more than all the millions my cousins or my brother ever chased. It was the exact validation I had searched for my entire life, but I finally realized I had the power to give it to myself and to others. Every time I sign a grant for a new family, I think about Richard and Thomas. I think about my father rotting in a federal prison cell, stripped of his tailored suits and his arrogant pride. He sits behind steel bars with nothing but the memory of his own failures to keep him company. I think about my brother wandering the streets with absolutely nothing, completely abandoned by the shallow people he spent millions trying to impress. They had access to an absolute empire. They had every advantage and every privilege this world could possibly offer, but they were so completely hollow inside that no amount of money could ever fill the void. They were terrified of hard work and terrified of the truth. They traded their own flesh and blood for the illusion of power. They chose to be monsters. I chose to be a survivor. I looked down at my scarred hands. These hands dug through the toxic ashes of my own home to find the truth. These hands held the rusted box that everyone else thought was garbage. My grandfather knew that the fire would eventually come. He knew that greed would eventually consume his son. He trusted me to stand in the wreckage and build something better. The world operates on a very fragile currency of appearances. People judge you by the clothes you wear, the car you drive, and the perfection of your physical body. They worship outward glamour only to burn themselves out with greed. My father called me a disabled child, but he didn't know that an imperfect body can still possess an upright soul. Your value doesn't lie in what others mock, but in your patience in finding the truth from the ashes. If this story resonates with you, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel to spread the message. Being underestimated isn't a sentence. Sometimes it's the perfect opportunity to turn the tables.